Hello, everybody. I don't know why I started stuttering there. But yeah, welcome back to ESAS. We are continuing with this Bloodborne video that never seems to end, never seems to stop. But we're getting there. As you can see, we're at 5.5 hours in. We got 2 hours left, less than 2 hours. We are getting so close. We are getting so close. And I cannot wait to actually finish this fucking video, because I think this next section will actually be interesting, because I hope that Acer talks a lot about some of the cooler aspects of this next section with the research hall, because I think it's a good mix of interesting gimmicks along with some interesting lore stuff. So I'm very much looking forward to, getting through it and seeing what he has to say. Now, granted, I've said that a couple times already, and he's not delivered on half the stuff I wanted him to talk about. So here we are. Also, hey, Andrew, glad to see you here. And also you too, Vic. You saw me highlight your comments earlier. But let's get into it and see how he deals with the research hall. Because holy shit, this last section was long and kind of underwhelming.
I've already talked at some length about Miyazaki's recurring theme of flow, but water in and of itself is notable here because it seems to be a barrier between humanity and the Great Ones in some capacity. It seems like it's an important step to ascension, and so we saw Willem meditating by the lake, and in the research hall, we come to see patients whose heads have been surrounded by water in an attempt to make them have insights into the cosmos. Another place water is seen is in the Loch Shield, which can be looted from this area, and the Lake Carol ruins. Loch is just an old-timey way of saying lake, and it's a great way to defend yourself against arcane attacks. And the lake runes all give some sort of damage reduction as well. The Great Lake runes description reads, a secret symbol left by Carol, runesmith of Bergenworth.
There's the one thing I mentioned in the previous stream, talking about sort of what he's doing here with this weapon. I'm not really talking about what he's talking about, but what he's specifically doing in the footage is
in the Loch Shield, which can be looted from this area.
Like the way his weapon works and the way he chooses to use it is part of the reason why I think this weapon is neat. But again, a lot of weapons in Bloodborne are neat, but you need to use them optimally. And this is the kind of thing that I mentioned near the end of the previous stream when he was talking about this specific weapon. Because, as you'll see, he will mute this so I can talk while he's doing this. But you'll see him, buff it and then go in using the special move of it. He'll get one hit in, then do the grindy bit, right? Good damage this time because he's probably upgraded it, All in all, fun weapon to use. It's always nice to have a chainsaw in a video game. And then you have this where, the reach of the weapon doesn't stop the enemy from smacking him, right? And that's the kind of thing that I complained about in the previous stream, where it's like the weapon is not, suited for enemies that, do any sort of attack, if they come from anything other than a small sort of angle in front of you or wherever you happen to be aiming that weapon, right? So, neat weapon. Probably shouldn't use it like a chainsaw the entire time. But anyway, let's get back into this Carol rune thing he's talking about.
This transcription of the Great One's inhuman voices ripples like a watery reflection. This rune means lake, and those branded by it enjoy augmented defense. Great volumes of water serve as a bulwark guarding sleep and an augur of the Eldritch truth. Overcome this hindrance and seek what is yours. And it should also be noted that after defeating Rum, the Moonside Lake at Bergenworth teleported us to Yahar Ghul, and that in Yahar Ghul we could find giant water-carrying urns which we could use to teleport. Water is the barrier between worlds in this game, which explains why you get an animating water texture when you're summoning. And the idea with the patients in the research hall is that they are submerged in it constantly.
This is one funny thing is I know he's talking about lore and all that, talking about the water, sort of being sort of like the thing in between, sort of the barriers in between worlds and stuff like that. And all that's true, right? I've got no problem with the lore he's talking about right now. Totally makes sense. Totally viable in the lore. Seen plenty of videos from Vadi on it. It's like totally agree. I'm just laughing at the footage because it shows him trying to use the weapon as the chainsaw, and then he gets fucked because it's a slow weapon if you don't use it in chainsaw form. I just find that funny.
To allow them to have audience with the great ones. The research hall itself is probably the most intricate interior area in the entire game. Its design seems to be iterating on Demon Souls' Valley of Defilement, what with enemy corpses falling from above into the little pool near the base of the pillar, connecting and supporting the stairs, as well as Dark Souls' Duke's Archives, with movable steps reorganizing the entire level layout. Another example of Miyazaki cannibalizing himself to great effect. The enemies spawning in the pool isn't as dynamic as the Leechmonger's boss arena, since the enemy corpses aren't ones we kick down, but rather are spawned in the very moment the stairs are raised. But it's still reminiscent of that area's gimmick, and I like that it was revisited here. As for the Duke's Archives, that level always felt kinda half-baked to me, so I'm really happy to see that concept delivered on as well as I think it is here.
Okay, hold on. Now we got an actual point to like talk about. Let me get back up so I can get the full clip.
For example, of Miyazaki cannibalizing himself to great effect. The enemies spawning in the pool isn't as dynamic as the Leechmonger's boss arena, since the enemy corpses aren't ones we kick down, but rather are spawned in the very moment the stairs are raised. But it's still reminiscent of that area's gimmick, and I like that it was revisited here. As for the Duke's Archives, that level always felt kinda half-baked to me, so I'm really happy to see that concept delivered on as well as I think it is here. The stairs in the beginning of this level direct the player for what the rest of it will consist of, that is, going up. And the sprawling nature of progression makes the level a bit difficult to wrap your head around.
Wait a minute. So what is his? I'm a little fuzzy on his point with this. It's like he kind of led with his like it's like he led with his point of the argument, and then he started giving context later. And I'm just a little brain fogged by it right now.
As for the Duke's Archives, that level always felt kinda half-baked to me, so I'm really happy to see that concept delivered on as well as I think it is here. The stairs in the beginning of this level direct the player for what the rest of it will consist of, that is, going up. And the sprawling nature of progression makes the level a bit difficult to wrap your head around. I think the generous shortcuts and changing map layout go a long way to make this a level players want to visit, but the enemy design I also like, and that's actually true of the entire DLC.
Okay, so he's just gonna skirt over that real quick of just like Duke's Archives half baked, but I like the shortcuts in this level. It's like what? Why'd you bring up the Duke's Archives then? It's like I know that like these types of levels where you're supposed to go like vertically or not vertically, actually yeah, vertically. Yeah, it's like you're supposed to go like up. Like in the Duke's Archives, you go up and down a lot. And you have to do that in order to progress through the area to beat it. I just wonder. I wonder what he would say about like other levels throughout these games that have a verticality to them. It just makes me wonder what his perspective on this is on that because calling the Duke's Archives half baked just feels like a shit take of Dark Souls 1, right? Because I think the Dark Archives, I think the Duke's Archives are actually a pretty good example of how From Software can make an interconnecting level that requires you to think about which direction you're heading and at what level, not in terms of like character level, but like physical level of the place you're at, right? Like I think part of the fun of navigating the Duke's archives is that you have to figure out, okay, where do I need to go to progress, and where can I go given the way the multiple floors work, and given the way that the multiple shifting platforms work, right? That's one thing that I think makes that area unique as a gimmick, sort of, but also I think it's a level that works pretty well given what it's trying to do. So him saying it's half baked and then talking about this level doing something sort of similar with shortcuts and then various pathways, it feels like a really floppy point that doesn't actually mean anything when it's the same sort of standard between the two different areas he seems to be comparing. It also might just be the wording. Like the wording's not that clear on what his point is with the Duke's archives compared to this level. But maybe he's like building up to it. I don't know.
I think the enemy layouts are really strong here. If we isolate the enemy talk to the game's mandatory portions, then there's a lot of overlap, maybe more than you realize on an initial playthrough. Most of the enemies introduced in Central Yharnam in the beginning are mainstays throughout the entire game, like the Huntsman's Minion, the Carrion Crows, Dogs, Yharnamites, and Skirts Beasts. Each new area has at least one new enemy type introduced, but since the old ones tend to show up again, there's a really strong sense of cohesion. The exception in the main game is the Nightmare of Mensis, but since that's a nightmare, it doesn't really matter. And here, the same logic applies. It's really commendable, I think.
So because this is a nightmare, it doesn't matter? I mean, like, I don't think it's... I think using the nightmare as sort of a crutch for saying things doesn't matter in a game, I think is a bad way to phrase comparing different things, because it does matter because it's in the game, right? Like it's in the game as content you can partake in. So it naturally does matter, for the sake of the gameplay. It's just weird. And this is one thing that I think actually kind of hurts Bloodborne, is that you and some of the other games suffer from this too. But I think one problem with I'd say Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, and Elden Ring is that you encounter the same sort of enemies throughout the game regularly. And when I say that, I mean like enemies that you encounter them multiple times at different points in the game, and basically all that happens is like a texture change or like a buff to health and damage, right? So largely the enemies do not change and they fight the same. So you're fighting a tougher version of a previous enemy that's artificially tougher and has the same move set, only now you're higher level and you should have access to more stuff by that point, especially in like a Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, because of like new weapons, new spells, and stuff like that. Things that do significant, or things that change the combat significantly for your character versus the enemies you have, and that's one thing that I think can kind of bog down the experience when you have the same types of enemies where they're just arbitrarily scaled up in terms of the stats, right? Instead of making or having new enemies to encounter, you're essentially fighting the same thing again, but later, and they're just a little bit harder this time. And that is one thing that I think is a problem for several of the From Software games, sort of like Bloodborne and on, where you fight a lot of enemies that are similar, like largely similar to what you fought before in terms of the way the combat works with them. And you saw that in the Hunter's Dream, right? Like there are a couple times through like sort of the base game Bloodborne where you can encounter like enemy hunters, that have guns and fight you with those guns and fight you with their melee weapons and stuff like that, right? So they fight a particular way. Then you get to the DLC and then you see that again, but their health and damage has been buffed, right? So it's not as much of a new encounter as it is just an updated encounter per where the game or per where the developers think you'll be at level wise, right? This is one thing that I really do have to give to Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, and Dark Souls 2, is that throughout the game, you will largely fight new enemies as you go through the areas, right? And that's one thing those first three games did really well, was consistently, or at least fairly consistently, give you new enemies to face in each area. Like if you take the classic example of just Dark Souls 1, just because Dark Souls, the team that worked on Dark Souls 1 went from this to Bloodborne, that's probably the fairest comparison. But when you look at Dark Souls, you begin the game with hollows, right? Just, different variations of hollows, but they still fight differently. You have the really, really weak ones with the broken straight swords. Then you have the ones that have a little bit more armor. They might have a shield. They might have like a spear that might shoot a crossbow at you. Then you've got sort of the Balder variation on that, where they can parry you. They've got like shield attacks they can use to break your stamina, and then after you kind of get through the Undead Burg, Undead Parish area, you sort of, then you can work your way down to the depths. You start dealing with like assassins that deal bleed damage and things like that. So it's a different type of enemy, along with like some dogs, and then when you make it down, through, or not through, but you make it down past the Gaping Dragon, or like on the way to the Gaping Dragon, you fight a bunch of like rats, and that one channeler. Then you make it towards the rafters around Blighttown, and you've got different enemies there, and by that point, once you're done with Blighttown, you come back out, you've dealt with several different types of enemies in that little space alone, right? And then as you continue through the game, the number of enemies and the variety of enemies evolves as the game progresses, obviously, kind of like what you would want in a game, right? Sen's Fortress has the snake dudes. Then you get to Anor Londo and you start getting some of the big giants. You get the various knights, whether it be the Black Knights or the Silver Knights, and then you start going down the four corners of the world. You get the regular skeletons until you get to what's his face, Pinwheel. And then you get the bigger skeletons, and then the dog skeleton variations on your way, to Nito. Duke's Archives, you deal with crystallized sort of enemies. So somewhat similar to basic hollows, but now they have a heavy resistance to magic, and they can be buffed. Then you deal with, more snake men and Pasakas, which makes sense because the snake men are like servants of, or not just servants, but like agents of Seath, but you still deal with new enemies in those areas leading up to Seath. Bed of Chaos, the pathway down there, dealing with demon bosses you fought previously, but now they're regular enemies, which conceptually makes sense. And so you're fighting something that was a boss, now it's a common enemy. I don't really count it the same way as what I'm talking about here, with sort of the same basic enemies just getting buffed. These are bosses that used to be bosses, but now you're at a point where you should be able to take them on fairly, on a fair sort of even ground as a regular enemy, right? And then you deal with the little floating dudes that spit fire at you, and then you make your way down past the centipede demon, and you go through the lava area where there's more floaty dudes, but then you also get like the big, like suction cup dudes that like will try to grab you and like spit shit at you. You also got the jumping enemies in the big lava lake. And then when you go to the Four Kings, you deal with the ghosts that function very differently from a lot of enemies in the game. Then you fight the Dark Wraiths, and if you use the shortcuts around that area to get to different places, you encounter other enemies as well, like the crystal dudes around the Hydra, the dragon bums. Yeah, the dragon bums. The great dragon the great dragon asinines. But like the point, like with Dark Souls that I'm making though, is that you get a lot of different enemies throughout the entirety of the game, and very few of them are just the same enemy with buff stats. And that's my main point, right? And I just laid all that out by just explaining all the different enemies. Now, granted, sometimes the enemies may fight similarly. They might have a consistency with shield use. They might all have a shield bash of some variety. They might all have some basic combat things, right? But they have different moves, different aesthetics, and things that make the fight feel more unique and different because you're going through a new area. The problem with Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, and Elden Ring to a certain extent is that they tend to feature the same enemies again, but they're buffed, right? And just a couple quick examples, then I'll move on with the video. Like Dark Souls 3, for example, you go through a lot of hollows and a lot of hollow knights, in the high wall, like during the high wall section, right? And then, you come back to that later, when you get the first three um, Lords of Cinder killed, right? Then you go through sort of the high wall that leads up into, the actual like Lothric Castle bit, right? And then you get buffed versions of those enemies that you fought previously, right? It's a very lazy way to repeat assets. Now, conceptually, I think it does work for Dark Souls 3, and I think it does work for Bloodborne and Elden Ring as well, because it makes sense why those types of enemies would be where they are. But from a gameplay aesthetic and from a gameplay variety perspective, it does get repetitive, and Elden Ring's got the same thing with a lot of the soldiers you encounter, in Limgrave. They pop up in Caelid with buff stats. They pop up in Altus Plateau with buff stats. They pop up in various areas. Now, granted, they're not as common as, let's say, the Yharnamites in Bloodborne. I think Bloodborne probably has the worst case of repeating the same enemy and just buffing stats. Given that, I don't think it's a bad displacement of enemies. Again, conceptually and aesthetically, it makes sense why they would be there. So I'm not necessarily complaining about it from, does it make sense sort of a standpoint. But it would have been nice to have a little bit more variety as opposed to just the same enemies we fought previously, but now they're buffed. It's a very lazy way to introduce more enemies that are quote unquote tougher, even though they function the same, or largely the same. But anyway, let's get back to this. Get back to this video.
That the enemies are as cohesively located. Wheelchair-bound Yharnamite in the tower to Upper Cathedral Ward aside. But I really do like that once the laws of reality around us get shifty, the developers allow themselves to get a bit more expressive in what enemies we're fighting. As it relates to the main game, the cohesion links back to what I said about Bloodborne being the most localized Miyazaki game. That is, the enemy variety has to justify its existence in vicinity to the rest of the enemies. But even in the optional areas, it's more...
Wait a minute. Let's go back. I want to get that point again.
That is, the enemy variety has to justify its existence in vicinity to the rest of the enemies. But even in the optional areas, it's more than just the same enemy models appearing often. There seem to be archetypes which get repeated as well. Much like Yharnam in the beginning, the fishing hamlet will have dogs and giants and villagers, and many Chalice dungeon enemies seem like reskins of the enemies from the beginning as well. Think how the Merciless Watcher looks an awful lot like the Huntsman's minions. In lore, this is because the introduction of the Old Blood is reawakening Yharnamites to these same archetypes as it did to the Sumerians. So, yes, the Huntsman's minion is literally a callback to the Merciless Watcher. But, ignoring canon for a moment, this might have been a design consideration incorporated into lore, rather than lore which was economic to realize in enemy designs.
I think I get where he's going with this. I think he's largely kind of talking about what I just said, where like it makes sense from a lore perspective why you get sort of recurring enemies or recurring types of enemies. It's just they try to kind of retexture them, or make them feel different, even though they might function the same. Which I think is fair-ish. I say fair-ish just because, again, like throughout the game, you're dealing with a lot of similar enemies.
Probably these sorts of enemies just congealed the best with the core combat, which explains why they were largely brought back in different forms when it came time to do the DLC. Admittedly, it might be that the dogs and villagers we encountered in the fishing hamlet are actually built on top of the standard villager and dog enemy objects, and that the similarities arise from there. The team already had a script for villagers patrolling the town with a dog, so reskinning those villagers and dog to have fish-like features and reconfiguring the patrol script for a new map layout might have been easier than assessing the parameters of the combat and building a new enemy from the ground up. A common complaint about the enemies in Bloodborne is that they can be a bit generous with the player's time. Bloodborne is faster.
They can be a bit generous with the player's time. What do you... What? What?
They can be a bit generous with the player's time. Bloodborne is faster than Souls, and because of that expectation, when enemies waste your time, it feels more grating than I think it really is. I'm of course talking about unescapable grab attacks and our extensive recovery animations.
Okay. I mean, I don't think those things are necessarily... Okay, I'm going to go back and get his full point on this, because I think what he's saying is coming from a understandable place, but I think he's misattributing certain aspects of the gameplay to one thing when the complaint lies in another place.
A common complaint about the enemies in Bloodborne is that they can be a bit generous with the player's time. Bloodborne is faster than Souls, and because of that expectation, when enemies waste your time, it feels more grating than I think it really is. I'm of course talking about unescapable grab attacks and our extensive recovery animations.
Okay, so he attributes those things to wasting the player's time. That's not wasting the player's time, that's the player suffering because they failed. It's similar to if you make a dumb mistake and fall off an area and die because of fall damage. It's like you made a mistake. You failed an encounter, or you did something you shouldn't have, and then you were punished for it. That's not wasting your time. That's the game. That's you doing something that gets you into a situation where you are supposed to suffer. You are supposed to fail, right? That's not a good... I mean, first off, I don't really think the argument that the game wastes your time is a strong argument in and of itself, right? But just that's such a weak argument to begin with, and the counter argument he's making is also weak. Like it feels like two people made straw man arguments and then had them go head to head, and this is where we are. I mean, if you wanted to talk about the game wasting your time, I would say you could attribute the game wasting your time to the way the level up system works. Where you have to go through a loading screen to level up, and then you have to go back through a loading screen to get back to where you were, right? Or having to go somewhere else in the map that requires warping. You have to go through two loading screens to do it. Those are things I would definitely attribute to wasting the player's time, because we have previously seen a better way to do it, right? So it's not like this grab attack animation is the problem, right? Like Bloodborne, this is one thing where it's not necessarily that the loading screens take a long time that are the problem in this situation. It's the fact that you have to leave an area, go somewhere, do a thing, then come back to that area where you were previously. When in, say Dark Souls 1, you could just rest the bonfire, level up, and then keep going. You don't have to go through a loading screen. All you do is rest, and it's such a missed opportunity, right? And there's one thing that I harp on a lot, but it's like the bonfire system in Dark Souls 1 was a fundamental change to the way players interact with the world of the game that it's set in, right? Like, think of it this way. Part of the fun of being able to explore Elden Ring is that you don't have to constantly go back to a hub in order to level up, right? Imagine if you were exploring Elden Ring and you always had to go back to the round table hold to level up, right? That would be incredibly time wasting, right? Especially when you have to open your map up, drag all the way down to where it is, assuming you drag it. You can look it up too, but you basically have to do the loading screen thing, and then you go through another loading screen after you level up to get back. Whereas at Sites of Grace, you touch them, you level up, you keep exploring, right? It's a good way to focus the gameplay, and keep it pressing forward. And that's the biggest problem with this system that they did in. That's the biggest problem with the system of leveling up in Demon Souls, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, is you are being forced by the developers to go back to an area when, excluding Demon Souls, you had a better system in place beforehand, right? That allowed gameplay to continue. And again, some people say that it's because they want you to interact with an NPC. It's like you can have an NPC that you interact with that doesn't have to be in the hub, right? You don't have to have a active hub that you return to over and over and over and over. It's like there are opportunities to do better design choices here. And I think Elden Ring actually touches on this a little bit pretty well. Melina is an NPC that you need for the story of the game to work, right? And she talks to you at Sites of Grace. You don't have to go back to a hub over and over and over and over to talk to her. She appears with you and you can talk to her, right? That is a really, really nice blend of previous ideas of having a hub with an NPC to talk to, as well as someone who is there to help you level up. They meshed them together in Elden Ring, and I think they did a really fantastic job of blending the two ideas of having a place where you can sit and level up real quick and keep exploring, while also allowing you to delve into some lore and talk to an NPC. It's a good hybrid of the previous systems they employed. My biggest problem, though, is obviously Dark Souls 2 and 3 should not have had the same system as Bloodborne and Demon Souls. They should have been the same as Dark Souls 1. Now, if they wanted to make Bloodborne the same as Demon Souls in that regard, that's their choice, right? It's a different universe than Dark Souls. It doesn't have to be the same. It's just a letdown because it does impact the playtime and it impacts how you progress through the game because you have to go through 2 loading screens in between leveling up, right? That is a definition of something that wastes your time when there is a previous system that was way quicker, way faster, and allowed you to level up wherever you were and continue progressing, right? And that's the kind of thing that I would say is the biggest waste of time in these games, that have that system, is that going through a loading screen, leveling up, coming back. You could just sit at something and do your shit and then get back to playing. That's my whole thing. Yeah, and as you said, Andrew, lanterns are probably the weakest. Well, I'd say lanterns and bonfires in Dark Souls 3 are probably actually, no, I take that back. Lanterns are the weakest sort of checkpoint systems they've created, as far as I can tell. Because from what I understand, Bloodborne is the only game with these things where all they do is send you back to the hub or act as respawn point or act as spawn points for certain areas. As far as I know, every other game from Demon Souls up to Elden Ring, I never played Armored Core 6, so I don't have a clue about that. But Demon Souls, well, excluding Demon Souls, because that was kind of the first of its kind, right? So Dark Souls 1 had it where you could warp to any other bonfire from a bonfire once you figured it out, or to specific bonfires. Dark Souls 2 did simplify the way bonfires work in terms of what you could do with them, like upgrading, leveling up, and that. But they did allow you to warp to other bonfires. You didn't always go back to the hub. Now, there were a couple bonfires that sent you back to the hub naturally, but I'll forgive that since there's 7 of them in the game out of the 77 bonfires. Excuse me. But Bloodborne lanterns, you just go back to the hub. That's the only thing they do. They don't do anything with your resources. They don't do anything with leveling up. They don't do anything with upgrade. They do nothing, right? They are about as simple as having an actual checkpoint in a game pop up that you can, reload into, right? And I think that is a thing where just the lanterns could have been great. I mean, they're worse than every other teleportation method they've devised thus far. Every other one. Every other game has allowed you to either warp somewhere else, excluding Demon Souls again, because first thing they were doing, or at least the first game of this type, so I give them a little leeway with that. But Bloodborne probably is the weakest overall system for warping, and for the way their checkpoint system works into how these other things work. It's just it's not really that they should have been. It's not really that they could have been great. It's that they should have been more useful, and they just aren't. You know, like imagine if you could upgrade. You know, like if you wanted to like make it where lanterns allowed you to upgrade, that would easily give them some utility, right? You just like sit at the lantern and upgrade your shit, you know, while you're in the world. That'd be great. Even if you don't do the level up, like that would still be something, you know, or like change your runes out, you know. It's just that there's so much you could have done and they didn't for some reason, and it feels like a hugely wasted opportunity. Yeah, it's like you need to warp back to the hub if you want to go to another part of the map. It'd be really poor with load times, wasting time. Yeah, and Bloodborne already has a problem with load times, right? So compound that with trying to warp around. You know, like if you had to go from one area of the map to another, you shouldn't have to go back to the hub for that, right? Like you should not have to do that. You know, it's just that is such a time waster. And again, this is all because he said somebody complained about the game wasting time, and then cites it as the grab animations and your recovery time afterwards. It's like that is the least of the time wasting problems, my dude. But maybe he'll mention other stuff.
And it's not just that the player wants to be fast, the game's rally mechanic is constantly directing them to be fast. Once you learn to rely on the rally mechanic, it can be pretty infuriating when enemy attacks stun you, since it eats into your window for recovery. But in the grand scheme of things,
and this is one thing, I don't know if he missed it, but not only does it eat into your time to recover health, it also resets the amount of health that you can gain, because it's not one singular bar every time you get hit. And you can notice that whenever he takes multiple hits of damage quickly, the amount of health that you can gain back is tied to the attack, the last attack that hit you. It's not tied to the total amount of attacks that you had previously, right? And that's something about the rally mechanic that I think does present an issue. Is if you get hit in a small combo and you lose, like, let's say, a third of your health instead of like a sixth of it. If you got hit twice and it took off a sixth of your health each time, you will only be able to get 1/6 back after that second attack hits you, because the rally mechanic does not account for speed. It accounts for last attack. The last attack is when the timer starts, not when the first one does. And the amount of health you can gain back is limited to what that last attack was. So if you get hit by a massive attack and then you get pecked by a little thing, that little thing is going to be the amount of health you can get back, right? That's one thing about the rally system, that while I like the rally system, it can get really fucked if you get tapped by a light attack at the end of a massive attack, right? You know, it's one of those things that I think does affect the way the combat system works regarding the rallying system, you know, as sort of a negative. Which I think they actually fixed that in Elden Ring, but I might be wrong. Because I know Melania's Great Rune lets you recover health by damaging if you lost it recently. It's essentially the rally mechanic, but I think they tweaked it. I don't remember, because largely by the time you get Melania killed, you've probably killed every other fucking thing in the game, and her Great Runes, you know, you got to go to a place, take a portal, then you got to take the tower thing, and then you know, yada yada yada. Like, it's so by the time you get Melania's Great Rune, you're basically done with the game and probably going into New Game Plus, and at which point you lose all your runes, or you lose all your Great Runes. So it's kind of a self-defeating. It's kind of a self-defeating thing. Actually, come to think of it, Melania as a fight, I could actually deal with the healing if it was like limited to how much like damage we previously did to her. Like if she had a rally mechanic, that would actually go towards balancing the fight in some way. But anyway, I'll talk about Melania later in another video.
those irksome moments, I think, are to the game's benefit. The scheme of things, since it can be directing them to be fast. Once you learn to rely on the rally mechanic, it can be pretty infuriating when enemy attacks stun you, since it eats into your window for recovery. But in the grand scheme of things, those irksome moments, I think, are to the game's benefit. It may not be fun to be knocked down in a game so dedicated to speed, but having to change up your approach, even into something objectively less optimal gameplay-wise, can do a lot to keep the player on their toes.
I mean, this is an argument where I understand where he's coming from, but at the same time, you can make an argument for a game literally throwing random bullshit at you too. Actually, good point. You can make the exact same argument that he's making right now for Dark Souls 2, and where you can give a pass, right, or for Bed of Chaos, right. The argument he just made, you can make for any bad game, right, that throws random shit at you that you're not prepared for, that's not been telegraphed to you, because it keeps you on your toes. It's like, because it keeps you on your toes is not a good excuse for bullshit in video games, right? That's one reason why players tend to hate things that are insta-kill moments, because they waste your time, and B, a lot of the time they're bullshit, right? Or it feels unfair, and some games are really bad about having insta-kill things that you have no way of getting out of, or have no way to understand the system at play before the insta-kill happens, right? A lot of trial and error games have that problem. Right. Didn't see the peel of any of the other great runes apart from Godric's for the stat buff of 5. I mean, some of the great runes in Elden Ring, I'm going to rant about this for a little bit, then we'll get back to the video. I promise. But like, some of the great runes in Elden Ring are truly good. Like, they're generally good, and I mean that in the sense of you can use them throughout most of the game, right? Like, Godric's is a good sort of base stat buff, which I think is good, and that can help lower level players use weapons that they may not have the levels for. Like, they're close enough, but they're not quite there yet, and so I think that Godric's rune is good. My personal favorite rune is Radahn's, just because you get a big boost or a sizable boost to your health, FP, and stamina, which you use a lot in the game. So having those is naturally helpful. Some of the other runes do work too. Like Rykard's rune isn't too bad, right? Where you get health back after killing enemies. It's not universal, but it is useful. Morgoth's rune is very simple. You just get a massive health boost, which I think is fine. Granted, I think it should have done more, or it should have something else to it. Mohg's rune, from what I've read and when I've used it, has been pretty shit. Yeah, like, not all the runes are great. Not all of them are great, but some of them are useful. And Melania's, while I like it, it just takes so damn long to get to. By that point, you've beat everything in the game. Right, once you defeat Melania, you've beat the hardest fucking thing in the game, right? So there's no point to have her great rune. Personally, I'd rather her great rune be what Godric's great rune is, and then maybe you could tie it in to maybe give him a healing factor, after you damage him or something. Like, you could work it around. It's just Melania's rune is next to useless by the time you get it, because unless you can use it in PvP, I don't see how you use it in the world when by the time you've killed Melania, you've probably conquered the game as a whole. Like, it's such a, like, it's like beating the hardest boss in a video game, and you get like a reward that is only useful for like the first 90% of the game. It's a really weird way to do it. Yeah, and Rennala for respec is nice, right? Even though, like, and this is one thing, I'm not a fan of respecing in these games. I know I'm sort of in the minority on that point, but it is nice that they gave Rennala something for players that want to respec, and for grouchy old men like me, we can just continue with the build we have and just suffer. Anyway, let's get back to this video, what he's talking about.
Speed, but having to change up your approach, even into something objectively less optimal gameplay-wise, can do a lot to keep the player on their toes. Repetitiveness kills engagement, so it's been standard practice in this industry to have the player be constantly stimulated by something different to break things up. In the moment, players may not like having to wait out an opponent's attack animation, but the alternative would quickly drain the player's focus. Something as inconsequential as a no-risk jump puzzle in the middle of a path is enough to keep the player from going on autopilot, and having to prioritize dodging a time-wasting grab attack rather than just going in and attacking can shake up the player's mindset just the same.
Yeah, and this is one thing that I will agree with Acer on, is that a lot of games nowadays do throw new things into the mix, when it comes to playing through a game. And you can go as far back as, you can go like really far back for examples. But like a really simple example that a lot of people will probably know is, if you've played any of the like Call of Duty Golden Age games, right? Basically from like Modern Warfare 1, the original, up to Black Ops 2, right? If you played any of those games, you will see those dynamics in place, right? Where you have your action missions, you have your vehicle piloting missions, you have your stealth missions, and they're interspersed next to each other, or they're subsections within the same level. Like a good example is Cliffhanger, very popular level from the classic Modern Warfare 2, right? You start off with a stealth mission with new tech. It's interesting, it's new, it's dynamic, and then you start to get into the gunning, the running and gunning thing after you blow up the fuel thing, and then you get on the snowmobiles. Almost said snow speeders. I'm thinking of Star Wars. You get on those and you jump a huge cliff to end the mission, right? It's a very dynamic mission, and it takes you through sort of all the things Call of Duty can do and what they used to do pretty well. And that's a good example of just very simple dynamics, right? And the Souls games do that as well, but in sort of in different ways, by having different enemies that work differently, different types of enemies that might do little damage, but there's a group of them, or it's a couple of tough enemies, or it's enemies that have a dynamic between them. Ornstein and Smough is a good example of that. They're a boss fight with a lot of dynamics between the two of them, and so that makes the fight interesting. And it is a thing where video games do tend to throw different things at you to challenge you in different ways, but also kind of keep you engaged. Part of the reason why you come to hate games after a while is because they do the same shit over and over and over and over and over, right? Like Outlast 1 is a really good example of being monotonous as fuck. You do the same basic shit and it's just reskinned, like for example, you your objective in Outlast might be find a key, avoid a dude. All right, push a button, avoid a dude. Push a button, avoid two dudes. It's the same basic shit of avoid things, and then interact with object to get to the next stage where you avoid thing and interact with thing, right? It's very, very repetitive and boring. So by the time you get to the end of Outlast, you're just ready for it to be fucking over because you've done the same mechanical shit over and over and over and over and over and over and over. Especially when it's as linear as Outlast is. And I think Outlast is actually a really good example of how to do a bad gameplay loop, right? Because you get scary thing, flaunted in your face. You run from it and avoid it while trying to find a way to open a pathway forward, right? Or you just have to run to begin with, and you'll reach the next section, right? It's just really boring, and that's one reason why, in my initial run of Outlast, I think I beat the whole game and the DLC in 6 hours. When I redid it for my no commentary run, I beat it, I think, in 3.5 hours, including DLC, because the game is boring as fuck. And once you know how to get past the enemies, it's a breeze. And a lot of games have that problem where it's just the same shit over and over and over, and there's no dynamicism to it.
Going back to the nugget of information I talked about earlier, which incidentally comes from our sister industry, gambling, human beings become more addicted to unpredictable rewards than they do predictable ones. Seemingly, this is because the anticipation period automates itself when you know what you're getting and why. To be fully immersed takes a degree of uncertainty, which can be simulated somewhat by randomness. Changing things up and betraying the player's expectation every now and then can do a lot to keep players playing, can do a lot to keep them from losing interest. And we see as much in the enemies here. Not every patient in this area is hostile, so FromSoft manages to pack in some storytelling. I said earlier in this video that more passive NPCs would have been appreciated, so it's only proper for me to point out that now I'm getting exactly what I wanted.
One thing I do want to bring up real quick, talking about his point, he said this a couple of times in the video, which I always found kind of weird, is, he'll say, I'm expected to acknowledge when the game gives me what I wanted when I asked for it in the earlier bit in the video. He's phrased it that same way a couple times now, and it's like, we know, like, we expect you to acknowledge when the game gives you something you're asking for. It's a really weird thing in script writing where you go, I wanted this enemy to give me a sword, and then this enemy gave me a sword. I have to acknowledge that the game gave me a sword that I requested, that I would like to have. It's like, you don't have to tell us all this shit. Like, we can infer it by the fact that it is existing, and you can bring it up in just one, couple word thing. It's like, I do it all the time where, I might bring something up, and then when the game does do something related to that, I'll say, like I said earlier, I'll just put that at the end of like a phrase or something, right? It's really simple to do. You don't have to give this big disclaimer of, hey, the game is doing something I really wanted it to do. Now we all know. Let's make sure we're on the same page. It's like, we get it.
I noted back in that talk that Bloodborne had about 25 NPCs, and I excluded these guys in that tally because they're barely even here. But in hindsight, maybe I should have included these guys, considering I think many of them do much more to prop up the story being told here than many of the NPCs in the main game do of propping up that story. Adeline over here willingly gave herself to the healing church against Lady Maria's wishes, and she's quite possibly the only sane person left in this entire establishment. She asks the player to acquire for her brain fluid, whose item description reads, "Grayish amoeba-shaped brain fluid wobbles and bounces. Extract it from a patient whose head expanded until that was all that they were. In the early days of the healing church, the great ones were linked to the ocean, and so the cerebral patients would imbibe water and listen for the howl of the sea. Brain fluid writhed inside the head, the initial makings of internal eyes. Each time."
Yeah, Vic, that's basically what I'm saying. Is like some of the stuff just feels like word salad BS, just to kind of point you back to what he said earlier as, look at me, I'm acknowledging the thing. I'm doing the thing. Please don't think I'm lying. Like, it comes across as like he thinks his audience thinks that he's not telling the truth, which I would infer, or I would experience just because he said a lot of shit in this video that I think is untrue, or at the very least is misinterpreted. But yeah, it's like there is a little bit of word saladiness to this video that I think does adversely affect it.
Time we gift Adeline brain fluids, she in turn gifts us progressively better items, starting with single-use healing vials, then giving us the balcony key, which gives us access to the Nightmares version of the Lumenflower Garden, and then finally, at the end of her quest line, she gifts the Milkweed Rune. Brain fluid is simply eyes on the inside before they fully materialize as eyes.
Yes.
And fun fact,
yes,
it takes
Andrew.
3 of these for Adeline to see the image of the Milkweed Rune, which is one way humanity can transform to kin, just like it takes 3 umbilical cords for us to ascend to a Great One.
Oh no, the blob died.
The lumen flowers have an affinity with the moon, hence the name, and they bloom at night. Something I really appreciate is that when we enter the lumen flower garden, the patients are at peace tending to the flowers, so we get to see the effects they have on the patients in real time. Those sorts of moments, the little tranquil scenes we walk into from time to time, are something these games really excel at. We are, most of the times, running with an elevated stress meter, so when the game sees itself fit to give us something more peaceful, it's all the more appealing for it.
I like how he's talking about peace while he's getting spammed by arcane spells. It's like, yeah, these areas can be very interesting when they're peaceful until you interact with them, then it becomes a shitstorm.
Of course, the patients in the Lumenflower Garden are vicious and can easily take down the player, so that last part might not apply here.
It's like, look at this argument I'm making. By the way, this area is not a good example of it, even though I use it as an example.
Regardless, I still think this little area is a welcome inclusion, and fun fact, it was in discovering this area and the window back to the Grand Cathedral where I first figured out that the room with the beds was the Grand Cathedral in the first place. I think the reason I ultimately missed it the first time is that it had so many beds in it, and because the function of the room was very different. There being an elevator rather than a boss made me apply different mental schemas to it, which obfuscated to me that it was obviously a room I'd been in before, usually twice before, in a given playthrough. The objective
Did he just miss a note?
to me that it was obviously a room
That little white thing over there, that's a note, right? That looks like a note.
I'd been in before, usually twice before, in a given playthrough. The objective
I don't know if that's a note or not, but let me know if that is a note and if he missed it, because it looks like he missed it.
in this area is to raise the entire staircase to make it connect to the boss arena. I suppose if the ground level is from
Okay, that's not a note. Okay, I saw it again from a different angle. I guess it's just the lighting effect. There was a lighting effect affecting it, I guess. Imagine that. A lighting effect affected something.
Lichmonger's boss arena and the stairs and floors are from the Duke's archives, then the rafters in the top are borrowed from Anne Orlando. And I think the enemy placement in the rafters is very interesting. It would have been possible to have the patients man the beams, but I think they went with carrion crows and rats because players would know exactly what to expect from them.
The challenge here isn't in the fighting.
Again, that weapon not being good when it's in its chainsaw form. Enemy gets hit, rears back, and attacks him anyway.
It's that a single misstep means death, so it makes sense in terms of the game feeling fair that the enemy be something simple, something players are so intimately familiar with that they can line the enemy up with the layout of the map rather than having to be extra careful because they haven't fully memorized the attack patterns of the enemies, which got introduced just a few minutes ago. But
That's not to say that the research hole patients
are a bad enemy. Their degraded mental state is well captured by the setting, and their sounds and animations and the variety in which they come
makes them a real standout, even though they have as little screen time as they do.
We're going to be mopping up the first boss of this area, which are the Living Failures. The Living Failures capitalize on Bloodborne's more mobile combat system by having you fight many of them at the same time.
Man, imagine if you made that argument for every other multiple enemy fight in any other previous game. Imagine that. Imagine it.
Some of them deal arcane magic attacks, and others pursue you into head-on combat, so there's a bit of tactical.
What was that? I gotta go back and watch. I gotta wonder what's going through his brain as he's engaging in this boss fight. Right here.
And other
like buffs. Okay, let me mute this just so I can talk while he's doing this. All right, so he opens the door, sees a boss fight. All right, buffs his weapon, starts his heavy animation, and the enemy has a big slam animation. It's like you'd think you'd know that if you're making a commentary about this. You know, it's just like it's strategically. I wonder like how he decides what footage to use where. It's just odd.
Some of them deal arcane magic attacks, and others pursue you into head-on combat, so there's a bit of tactical decision-making embedded into this fight, a bit of target prioritization. I've heard people complain about this boss that it is a repeat of the Celestial Emissary fight from the base game, but that's a criticism which I've never gotten on board with. For one,
well, I mean, this is nothing like that because again, I don't know if these are an actual like community-driven like criticism that he thinks he's fighting against, or if it's like some straw man that he makes up to defend the boss. Because like, why would you compare this to the emissary? It's like the emissary fight is a bunch of little dudes with one dude that occasionally like puffs up, and then puffs up and it gets bigger. It's like these are just a couple of big dudes with a large health bar that cause like a big AoE attack to happen, right? They're very different, right? Now aesthetically, they are sort of all great one-ish evolutionary, like deplorably crafted things. But I mean, that's a weird. It feels like a straw man argument, is what I'm saying. Like, it feels like he's making a straw man argument to counteract it and say, "Oh, but this is better than what you think." Like it feels disingenuous. Like it sounds like he doesn't have an actual criticism of the fight. He's just making one up to make this boss sound better than what it is. And that's where I'm coming from. It's just it sounds off.
Complain about this boss that it is a repeat of the Celestial Emissary fight from the base game, but that's a criticism which I've never gotten on board with. For one, the setup to the boss arena and what this fight is asking of the player is completely different. And second, these guys aren't reskins of the Celestial Emissary. Their movement is borrowed from the Research Hall patients. In that sense, they serve as a sort of payoff to the previous area. It was in fighting these guys for the first time that I realized that the Research Hall patients are what the process of making Celestial Emissaries looks like. So even if there were grounds to complain in terms of the gameplay, lore-wise, I think these guys more than earn their keep, as they tell a much sadder story than most bosses in the game.
Again, this is one of those things where just because the lore makes it interesting or gives context to something doesn't mean the boss fight's good, right? Like if the Royal Rat Vanguard in Dark Souls 2 had a story on the level of Sith and Artorias, that boss fight is still shit. Okay, it's still just a bunch of rats that you kill until a rat with a mohawk appears and then you kill it, right? It is not a good boss fight no matter what the lore does to it, right? Now the lore might redeem it in some way, but as a fight itself, it is still a problematic boss fight. And this is one thing, I don't think this boss fight's necessarily bad, right? I just think it's a little tedious given how the fight works. It's just like the arguments of lore makes up for the lack of mechanics is like, no, they don't. That doesn't make up for the fact that the mechanics of a fight are not as good as they could have been, or aren't that interesting. Again, you could do the Rat Authority or the Rat Vanguard from Dark Souls 2. Both fights are shit, right? The lore doesn't save them. The lore is a one-time thing that you learn and figure out, and if it's good, it sticks with you. But upon replaying the game, like you're playing the game, right? There comes a point where you have to detach the lore from the way the mechanics of the game work because you are playing the game. Like the lore is not going to save you in the boss fight, right? They go together, but they don't directly impact each other.
Earn their keep, as they tell a much sadder story than most bosses in the game. Periodically, they like to summon arcane meteors like Rom did, but whereas Rom's meteors spawned over her head and you had to dodge them by running towards her, here the meteors come from a fixed area on the map. Due to the number of mobs in the Rom fight, Rom herself is not always in frame during that fight, so when the meteors came, sometimes they were able to completely blindside us. Here, there's a specific animation which all of the enemies go into, and there's a dark cloud which spawns in the area. So there's no ambiguity when the meteors are coming. And even though you might not be looking at any particular enemy, since the meteors have a fixed spawn point, you can just run right behind the giant lumen flower in the middle of the area and use it for cover.
Or you can use a backstab on an enemy and just do the backstab animation while the meteors are coming at you. Which is one thing that I found kind of weird, is like he was fighting an enemy. When they started doing the animation to have the meteor come down, he ran away from the enemy he was fighting, looked for another enemy to backstab instead. Which, I look at the footage and I go, why is this your strategy? Like, why do you do this? Why do you do how you do?
Now, I'm not saying that this is some groundbreaking fight for a Souls game or anything, but considering the way these guys sometimes get hated on, I feel they warranted a bit of defending. All things considered, I don't think Bloodborne has a single bad boss.
Oh, we would argue about that for days, Acer. We would argue about that for days. I think there are plenty of bosses in this game that you can consider bad, or at the very least, in the best case scenario, extremely underwhelming.
Previous FromSoft Souls games had bosses like the Capra Demon, Dragon God, Bed of Chaos, Ancient Dragon, and the...
Okay, he's talking about different boss fights here in comparison for bad boss fights, and here are things that I'm actually going to get into the meat of it.
As a single bad boss. The previous FromSoft Souls games had bosses like the Capra Demon.
All right, the bosses like the Capra Demon. Okay, Capra, I can kind of understand. The dogs gank you. It's very annoying. But the dogs also, but the dogs are also like fairly weak, right? So you can call it a challenge, especially when you can easily repeat the drop attack, right? Now it is hard to do that when the Capra's hammering you while the two dogs are coming to get you. And I would call that fight reasonably unfair, but it's still pretty manageable. And it's, a fight that I think is, on the end of annoying. I don't think it's necessarily a bad fight. I do think that it has problems, like significant problems. But I wouldn't call it an outright bad fight, right? Bed of Chaos is a bad fight because it's massively unfair, and the boss itself is just built to kill you in the cheapest way possible. It's not an actual exchange, which is what good fights are. Good fights are an exchange where you learn the moveset and you learn your moveset and you find ways to exploit the bosses in favor of your moveset or your attack set, for lack of a better phrase.
Dragon God, Bed of Chaos, Ancient...
All right, now he mentioned Dragon God. Dragon God as a gimmick, I think, is actually a pretty decent gimmick. It's not necessarily that dynamic, because you basically just run from one end to the other and like shoot it with some, what are they called? Just ballista, I guess. But I mean, it's not a bad gimmick, and it's nowhere near as bad as the Bed of Chaos. And like the Bed of Chaos, I think we would all agree is a bad boss fight. But I think it's only really a bad boss fight because of the crumbling floor. Like I mentioned in a previous stream, you take the crumbling floor out, I think Bed of Chaos, sits on par with some of the other Lord Souls in terms of the actual fight itself being unique, interesting, and dynamic, as opposed to just big tree slaps you into a death hole.
Ancient Dragon and the Royal Rat Authority.
And yeah, Ancient Dragon's an absolute bullshit fight, especially with that fire breath lasting for 10 damn hours. And he did mention the Royal Rat Authority. I mean, I'd put a lot more bosses from Dark Souls 2 for just being bad bosses, but that is a him thing. That's that. If he listed every bad boss fight previously, I think that would get a little tedious.
The worst bosses in Bloodborne are usually considered bad because they don't have enough going on to distinguish them, rather than because they were difficult for the sake of being difficult. And
wait a minute, what? What does he mean by this line?
Bloodborne are usually considered bad because they don't have enough going on to distinguish them, rather than because they were difficult for the sake of being difficult.
Wait a minute. Because they don't have enough to distinguish them, as opposed to be making them difficult for the sake of making them difficult. He does realize that making things difficult for the sake of difficult is the reason we got things like the Ancient Dragon and the Royal Rat Authority and other bad bosses like that are just cheap enemy spams or ridiculous damage numbers, right? Like, he does realize that. Like, he must realize that. And if he doesn't, holy shit. Like, part of the reason why a lot of boss fights in Dark Souls 2 are criticized is because they usually fall back on the same tired trope of spam the enemies at the player. Skeleton Lords, Royal Rat Authority, Royal Rat Vanguard, Ilana, the Squalid Queen, can summon several enemies during the fight. Look at Burnt Ivory King, right? That fight can be incredibly frustrating if you don't have the right setup for it. And it's the thing where it's like a lot of these fights rely on the same basic mechanical thing of let's throw a bunch of enemies at the player. That's how we make it difficult for the sake of difficult, as opposed to making it dynamic, right? And this is one thing that I think the Souls games are, or not the Souls games, but this genre as a whole, I think runs into a problem when you make things difficult for the sake of being difficult, as opposed to dynamic. I would take a game that is like Dark Souls, but every boss is dynamic and different from all the other bosses, rather than another Dark Souls game that's just harder, right? Because I think the dynamicism is part of the appeal of boss fight games like this, right? Like if all bosses fought the same, like for example, if you had a game where every boss was the level of difficulty of Melania, right? Would that be a good game? Right, just on the face of having bosses like Melania that are that difficult as a boss, as a sort of boss threshold where all the bosses are like that. Would that be engaging, or would it be more engaging to have a bunch of different boss fights that were more dynamic? Right? Personally, I would take the hit to difficulty, to not deal with the difficulty if the bosses are more dynamic. I would take that every single fucking day because I don't want to fight someone like Melania all the damn time. I don't want to fight enemies that just are ridiculously hard because they're ridiculously hard. I don't want to deal with that. I want to fight different bosses different ways because it's dynamic. It makes me remember them more. And it's also not about them being hard for the sake of it. It's about the quality of what makes them difficult to begin with, right? Like Calamite is a great fight in Dark Souls 1, not because he's difficult, but because his moveset is extremely varied. It makes sense. And because of that moveset, he becomes harder. He becomes more aggressive because that moveset is very punishing if you don't know what you're doing, right? And it's also a thing where a lot of those attacks are very, difficult to deal with for certain builds, but you can find ways around it. Seems like more Bloodborne good and Dark Souls bad. He's been famous for throughout this video. Yeah, like it feels like a cope. It feels like a cope to make Bloodborne look better. That's one thing. Again, I don't think this boss fight is bad. I think it's just a little tedious, right? I mean, it's similar to. I mean, I would actually argue it's similar to some bosses in Elden Ring, that are just tedious for the sake of it. It's just like, come on, dude. It's like it's not about things being hard that appeals to us. It's about being hard, dynamic, and fair. I think those are the three biggest elements to a good Souls boss fight.
And I don't think the living failures should be lobbed up with the lesser bosses of Bloodborne like they sometimes are.
Wait a minute. So are these compared to the lesser boss? Like, what lesser bosses is he talking about here? I'm just getting confused now by what he's saying. It's like, what lesser bosses are the lesser bosses in this game? Like, tell me, what do you mean by lesser bosses? I can infer that you're probably talking about like the Chalice Dungeon bosses, but I still don't know. Like, you're still not defining it enough for me to work with what you're discussing. We got the Belfry Gargoyles. Yeah, it's like just taking enemy, making more of them, and then make them fight the player when these systems are not built for multiple enemy combat, right? You can deal with them, absolutely, but these things thrive on one-on-ones. Just like, oh my god.
If they happen to kinda sorta look like a previous boss which played completely different, that's not a problem for me.
Wait a minute.
Sometimes are. If they happen to kinda sorta look like a previous boss which played completely different, that's not a problem for me.
Okay, I would agree with that.
The second boss of the research hall area is Mary.
I'm not your Mary.
Is Lady Maria. But before going in,
what was that? Is that like a community joke for him? That's so weird. Has he put any memes in this video at all? Based on the like 13 hours of streaming I've done on this, or however long I've spent on this? Because that meme just kind of came out of nowhere and threw me for a loop. Let me take a look at it again. I want to understand the meme.
Is Mary
I'm not your Mary.
is Lady Maria, but
That's weird. It's weird. It's weird when you get almost 6 hours into a video and then it drops a meme. It's like you could drop plenty of memes throughout these series or throughout any game. I do it all the time. It's fun.
before going in to kill her, I'd like to note that we are given motivation for the fight by Simon at the lantern near the access to the research hall. Miyazaki's previous games were very up.
Don't think so. It's usually been his fancy looking text describing things. Yeah, like that meme came out of nowhere. I was not prepared for a meme. That's not to say that you have to start every video with a meme to let me know memes are there, but it's just like this far in, it's like didn't expect a meme.
Upfront about your motives, but even so, you could have reasoned that since those worlds were full of monsters, killing them was probably a good idea. Bloodborne having human enemies who aren't insane or anything like that makes it so that such simplistic reasoning doesn't work all of the time. So if you want something deeper, you can reason that killing her is okay because Simon says so.
I mean, players kind of reason that it's okay to kill every boss just because the boss exists as a boss fight, and they are automatically triggered as boss fights 99% of the time. Like the only exception would be Gurman, right? Like Gurman's the only boss fight that can sort of spring upon you when you don't think he's a boss fight. It's just a lot of weird points. Just a lot of weird points.
Maria, like every other character in the DLC, is one of the most beloved characters in Bloodborne.
I like how he just has that blanket statement of, we all love everybody in the DLCs, right, fan base? It's like, yeah, there's a lot of characters throughout the entire game that you can, like, but holy shit, that sweeping comment of, we all love thing, applaud me. I have correct opinion. It's just, oof.
Every other character in the DLC is one of the most beloved characters in Bloodborne.
Actually, come to think of it, is like, if you pay attention to this series, the more I play this series, the more simpy it becomes, for lack of a better phrase. Just, there are so many fans of bosses just because it's woman that you can draw a kink from, that you can fight or do something with. Like think about it. Like, take all of the female characters out of the game and just focus on the male characters. See how many of them compare to the female characters, and let me know if there's like a surprisingly high level of kink and sexualness to it from the fandom in relation to the female characters that people love. I'm sure there's some for the men too, but I bet that there's a disproportionately large amount of the fan base that likes certain NPCs and bosses because of the dynamic that they could sexually create with like fan fiction and shit. I bet it's out there.
Like Ludwig from earlier, she seems to be split in the nightmare, with one half of her being able to put the fishing hamlet massacre behind her, and another half being kept in a permanently manifested version of the Maria she didn't want to be.
This is one random thing I want to bring up too, is I kind of wish bosses were spaced out more in some of these DLCs that they make. Like, he just beat a boss, and now he's going to go beat another one. Like, it's really weird when you have bosses right next to each other. That's one thing about Dark Souls 3's Ring City DLC that I always found weird, was you fight, like, you go through an area, and then you fight the Demon Prince, right? And then you go through basically all the rest of the DLC, and then you get Midir, Half-Light, and then after Half-Light is Gale. It's like directly after Half-Light, you go through a cutscene and there's Gale, or two cutscenes and there's Gale, right? And Midir is just off to the side. right? They lump all 3 of the bosses near the end of that DLC, and it's really weird. Now this DLC doesn't do that, which one thing is I'm thankful for. It's just I wish you could have had maybe like an area, then a boss, then an area, then a boss, then an area, then a boss, as opposed to having area, boss, area, boss, boss, area, boss. I think it would have. I think it helps with the dynamics of what you're going through when you go from an area you can explore and then you get a boss, right? That's one reason why I think the end game of Elden Ring is kind of a letdown, is because you go from Malekith to Gideon to Godfrey to Radigan to the Elden Beast. And it's like, yeah, Radigan and the Elden Beast are like a 2-parter, but still, it's like that's 5 bosses in a row to completion of the game that you can do in a row, right? And that's just a lot of boss in a very short time frame. It also doesn't help that half those bosses are shit, right? but anyway, let's get into this Maria shit. If you're a simp for Maria, hit F in the chat.
In the research hall, the patients who talked about Maria talked about her as being a very caring and nurturing individual. The balcony key we got from Adeline even notes that Maria gave it to her in hopes that the smell of the lumen flowers would bring Adeline some comfort. Side note, I like the little response our character has to being grabbed by Maria, and how the hands are a visual focus of this scene. It always plays to me like our character has an epiphany there about the doll's origin. The research hall gives the...
What did he just say about the hand gesture?
Bring Adeline some comfort. Side note, I like the little response our character has to being grabbed by Maria, and how the hands are a visual focus of this scene. It always plays to me like our character has an epiphany there about the doll's origin.
So he just headcanons that the animation is neat, even though we just reached out to touch a thing, because we do that a lot in these games just because. Again, I think he's reading into some of this stuff a little too much.
The research hall gives the sense that Maria was someone the patients held on to as they were losing their minds, and you really get the sense that she cared for them, that their suffering troubled her somewhat, and that she went out of her way to bring them comfort. The Maria they describe is a lot more like the doll than it is this Maria. This Maria is like a manifestation of everything Maria despised about herself. She fights with a Rakuyo, whose description reads, hunter weapon wielded by Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. A trick sword originated in the same country as the Kanehurst Chikage, only this sword feeds not off blood, but instead demands great dexterity. Lady Maria was fond of this aspect of the Rakuyo, as she frowned upon bloodblades, despite being a distant relative of the queen. One day, she abandoned her beloved Rakuyo, casting it into a dark well when she could stomach it no longer. Not only did Maria canonically already abandon this weapon, but as you can see as this fight goes on, her dislike of the traditionally blood-tinged weapons of Kanehurst gets neglected. She's shooting massive blood attacks in the latter half, and you get the sense that just like how Ludwig was a beast hunter, transformed by the nightmare into a beast as penance, Maria maybe was a more gentle character after the Fishing Hamlet massacre, who was forced to exist as those aspects of herself which she disliked, with her own kindness being extracted from her and placed into the doll. I think Maria really embodies the strength of the core combat system.
I was kind of hoping he'd bring that up, because throughout this whole fight, that whole first phase, he was just parrying, and now he's starting to do it again, where it's like you don't even really have time to see the dynamics of the Maria fight, in that like her moveset, like throughout each phase, is largely the same. It's just her attacks become more like far-reaching. Like her basic attack group becomes more powerful and more has a farther reach. Right? It's just like he's just parrying the crap out of her, making her look like an absolute bitch. And it's kind of funny to think of a game like this where he talked about like the fandom loving her as a character and all this stuff, and then like completely blitzing her boss fight. You know, just kind of seems like a disservice to the mechanics of the actual boss fight.
Because she can be a really exhilarating fight, even though she's just a modified NPC. If you pick your timing, you can pretty much lock her out of the fight by shooting her at the right times, but otherwise, you can just dash around the area like you would against most NPCs and fight her like you do them. I think the people who I have not yet convinced to like the Living Failures should consider that Maria is literally a retread of a fight we've had many times in this game already. She's super amped up, sure, but she has more in common with the Bloody Crow of Canehurst than the Living Failures did with the Celestial Emissary.
Is that because they're both humans that are ridiculously strong? As opposed to a bunch of little aliens with one of them getting bigger versus a bunch of big aliens that shoot meteors out of the sky? It's like the dynamic between the emissaries and the previous boss fight he just dealt with are wider in terms of what actually happens in the fight. Now, Maria is a lot bloodier than the Bloody Crow of Canehurst, ironically. But, I mean, they are humans, so they would naturally fight like some level of humanity, even though Maria is more buffed up and bloody.
Maria's placement at the end of the research hall is quite well considered, since she acts as a final threshold to cross before having the church's secrets be unveiled. But even more than that,
Unveiled. I just want to cap on that. Unveiled.
having the church's secrets be unveiled. But even more than that, I think it's good that the DLC decided to go for a boss like her. I consider Ludwig to be the best boss in the game, but I would really rather not have had the DLC be too repetitive, and thankfully, Maria is a very niche boss, even in the entire game, if we consider that. If we strike out every NPC fight and look solely on the bosses, then aside from Gascoigne, Mikolash, and Gurman, there is no boss quite like this. And of those three, Gascoigne and Mikolash both have some hook, Gascoigne turning into a beast and Mikolash being a chase.
I mean, I think you could draw a fair amount of comparisons between this and the Gurman fight, because Gurman does have some far-reaching moves. Now, Maria doesn't fight with a gun, so that does change sort of the dynamics of how she works compared to Gurman, but it's like, I do think that you could draw comparisons between some boss fights in this game, even though her moveset is very sort of intense in terms of like her like melee set, then she gets blood, then she gets big explosions, and then she gets like fire. It's like it does kind of escalate, whereas Gurman's a little bit more he's just fast and like really, like he's just fast and aggressive. Like Gurman fights more like a hunter, which is the difference between Maria and Gurman. You know, and that's why the dynamics of the fight change. Maria is more sort of a traditional boss fight where you deal with an enemy and you try to parry them. You know, whereas Gurman, you have to worry about him stunning you and stuff like that.
So even among those bosses, Maria is quite a standout in the game. It's very fitting that she and Gurman alone seem to fill this niche of being very satisfying NPC bosses, considering their relationship, and it is also fitting that they both fight you without malice. They both seem to genuinely display some care for you and put up arms because they think it is best for you that you do not go where you think you want to go.
Well, there's the Maria fight, talking about lore, and talking about how it's not like other fights, and then not really talking about the fight. He's done that a lot in this video, and it's annoyed the piss out of me. It's like, talk about the mechanics of the fight, dude. Talk about them in depth. Talk about like her moveset changing. Talk about the extensions of her shit. Talk about the different phases. Like, talk about the fucking game, please. Talk about the gameplay. I'm so tired of him not talking about gameplay. I mean, I bet if you took out half of the lore shit in this video when he's only talking about mechanics, I bet this video would be like 40 minutes long if you took out all the lore stuff he's talked about. Right? Like, if he only talks about mechanics and level design, maybe you get like an hour. It's just like, holy shit, man. There's so much in these games to talk about mechanically. Please talk about them. Like, holy shit. Yeah, been really lore heavy for the last 6 hours. It's like, break it up a little bit. And this is one thing too, is like one thing that I tried to do as I went along with my commentaries is, if I'm going to talk about a boss fight for a certain amount of time, I'm going to make sure that I use different footage of the fight to talk about different aspects of the fight, right? Like when I did my Dark Souls 3 commentary, I made sure that I captured footage of the game from multiple builds, right? That helps in terms of having different perspectives on the game, but it also helps for runtime whenever I need to talk about a boss, because I can have a boss fight like the initial run with like a tank build or something, showing you how the boss fight works. And then if I want to continue talking about the boss fight, I can put another recording of another fight against the boss in the background that looks different because it's a different build, right? And so it plays differently against the boss. This is just a thing where I wonder if he's capping his time to talk about bosses based on how long the boss fight actually lasts, right? Like, I wonder if that's how he's choosing to do this. Because it looks like he doesn't fight her anymore. And I wonder if that's just the way he does it, where he just times how long he can talk and then writes a script for it. Or if he just kind of wings it and just tries to make it work depending on the fight. Like, I don't know. I mean, this is one thing too about the boss fights, is like the Ludwig fight was a lot more interesting to watch. This one, he just parried the crap out of her in the first like phase and a half, and then just dodged and smacked like you do in most other bosses. Like he made the boss fight look not as dynamic as it is. Like he made the boss fight look very easy and underwhelming. Yeah, remember, he can't do that because Bloodborne doesn't have builds to be a better game. Yes. True, Andrew, true. Because the game doesn't have builds, and it's better for it, even though he talked about build variety. Yeah, we're remembering that. We remember things. Anyway, let's see how this goes.
The celestial dial we have to interact with before moving on from this area is a nice way to remind the player that they are currently very high up, which is something they might have forgotten if they died a lot to the living failures or to Maria. I've talked a lot about how the warping and how the loading screens can break up the world and segment it a bit, so giving us this item, I think, is a really good way of bringing us back into the geography of the area we inhabit.
I mean, I don't think that really changes anything if you get dropped an item when you're going to teleport to a new area, or not teleport, but when you're going to unlock a new area anyway. Like, it's a weird point he made.
The reason us remembering that we're high up is important, and this is why the Healing Church and the choir ultimately made the Astral Clock Tower and Upper Cathedral Ward their bases of operation, is because someone in their ranks once had the revelation.
he's doing he's doing like the cabbage head or the broccoli head.
That the cosmos might be closer to them than they realized. That is, that the sky and the cosmos are one. And also, that the cosmos might be very near to us, only just above our heads. This is what the
I like how he talks about lore all the time and then just skips over the doll mentioning shit after Maria gets killed. It's like, fuck, dude. Like, I feel like this video was made just for him to rant about things in Bloodborne, and then randomly throws in things about the actual game in as well. It's just, it hurts my brain going through this video. It really does. We got an hour and a half left. I don't know how I'm going to feel by the end of this. But I feel like one common theme is just exhaustion at the lack of talking about the actual fucking gameplay and how the game works and the actual shit in the game. It's weighing me down, man. It's weighing me down.
The choir believed, and they went up looking for the Great Ones. Consider for a moment that the only skybound phenomena we observe in-game is the moon, some clouds, stuff like that. Keep that in mind as we discuss the following. The entire world of Bloodborne is stacked on top of itself. Yharnam is built on top of the Chalice dungeons. The snail woman who fell to us earlier literally fell from the fishing hamlet, which was literally above us in the nightmare. You couldn't see the fishing hamlet from below, but you can see Yharnam under the water in the fishing hamlet. That suggests that there may be yet another layer on top of it, and what do you know? In the Nightmare Frontier, we could see the sunken sails from the fight arena against the Orphan. The Nightmare Frontier is the frontier of the Nightmare of Mensis, which is on top of that area, and its final area is the tower where we fight the Wetners. The idea that the sky and the cosmos are one might be hinting that the Great Ones live in an elevated world, one which we cannot fathom from below. Going back a bit, do you remember when I picked up the Make Contact rune? If you consider that the fishing hamlet and the Nightmare of Mensis are above the Dreamlands version of the Astral Clock Tower, then the placement of the Make Contact gesture makes a lot of sense. Doesn't it?
That was a weird little clip. There's a bunch of weird stuff showing up at the end of this video. And it's one thing where I can kind of attest to. It's like, as you produce the video over time, sometimes you do like change kind of how you're making the video. So sometimes things can change in terms of how like the video looks and the tone of it and when you choose to bring up clips and things. But it's really weird. It's like this is the first time we got a flashback. This is the first time we got a meme. It's like, I wonder if he's like chilling out more with the video during the DLC at this point, or if it's just his philosophy about making this video changed like near the end, and so it's coming out differently. It's odd. Like I'm curious how he structured this video initially, and if he chose to put in clips and like memes near the end, but didn't want to re-record and put in memes from like the earlier bits. Like I just wonder how he constructs videos now, because it seems a little bit stream of consciousness to a certain degree, because he tends to kind of just talk about whatever, like whenever he wants to bring it up. Which, I mean, I get. It's like there's no real fault, by doing that. I mean, it's your video, you make it how you want. But it does feel kind of weird to go back and think about it. It's like we've not had a meme, we've not had a flashback, and we've just had those. It's like I gotta wonder like how he made this video and what his thought process was, I guess, is the bottom line. Like I'm just curious about how he chooses to orchestrate these things.
We're in the fishing hamlet now, so I've decided to become a vegetable, and I'll be swapping out my holy blade for the moonlight sword, even though it's much weaker. Before going forward, I'm going to quickly summarize the lore of this area for those not in the know.
All right, he's about to talk about lore again, which I'm okay with because the lore here is interesting and, you need to talk about it for it to make sense. But one thing that I find weird is how he mentions these weapons that he gets, and he mentions that they're weaker. It's like, could you not take like half an hour of recording, and just go and farm for a little bit just to make the weapon on par? It's like, it feels like he's trying to do this in the least amount of time possible, as opposed to giving everything the time that you can to make sure things work, for you, right? It's just, it's just a weird thing. It's like, why not just take like a little bit of time, farm some shit, or buy it if you can, buy the upgrade materials and then just upgrade the weapon. It's like, it's not that time consuming. Like plenty of enemies drop, various upgrade types. I'm sure you could get at least to a +6 by this point. with like a half an hour farming. And even if you don't farm all the materials, you could probably buy, what you need to, again, get to at least a 6. I don't know when you unlock chunks or even if you unlock chunks from the messengers, but my point is that you can at least get to that point, put in a little bit of extra time to make your weapon feasible, and relatively upgraded to match the other weapons. It's weird. At times it's felt like he's just banged his head off a keyboard when scripting it. Yeah, it's just like a bunch of random things get brought up at different times, and it's odd. But let's see how this next bit goes, because this is the last bit of the DLC. So we'll see how it goes. This is actually kind of interesting to see like where people have watched the most stuff. So most people have looked at sort of the Nightmare Frontier, opening bits of Yharnam Nightmare, lead up to Ludwig, and then again the Lady Maria fight, introduction to the Hamlet, and then dealing with Hamlet lore. This is one thing that these kind of metrics kind of give you a little bit of insight into how people are watching the video, and it makes you wonder if the fans don't care about boss fights as much as like lore, because like the only boss fight that seems to get some decent attention is Gurman right here, or well, the ending boss fight right in the Hunter's Dream, because all these other spikes are not from boss fights. Like they're from like lore bits or random like introductions to levels, talking about different aspects of lore in those levels. But the only one kind of close is this Maria fight. It's like Maria and like some of the final bosses in the Dream. It's just, I wonder if this video is a product of the community that surrounds him, or if it's something he genuinely wants to make on his own, kind of a thing. Because I tend to make whatever the fuck I want, and if people want more lore, then they'll usually ask for it, and I'll try to do more of it in the future. But I still do what I want to do, talking about mechanics and shit. And I wonder if maybe he's just gotten to a point where he gives the audience that he's coalesced around him what they want, and so they naturally gravitate towards like the lore-heavy data mining, like production side of things, as opposed to talking about what we actually got and how it works. But anyway, we're almost 6 hours in. Let's get through this DLC.
Long ago, Bergenworth realized that they needed third courts to ascend and to become great ones. This was after the beasts began to roam Yharnam, and this was before Lawrence and Gurman constructed the Hunter's Dream. In these times, Gurman was the leader of the Hunters, and in Bergenworth's search for great ones, the fishing hamlet appeared. The people of the fishing hamlet look the way they do because they had a long-standing audience with cause. This area famously takes after H.P. Lovecraft's Shadow over Innsmouth, where, spoiler alert, skip to this timestamp if you want to read the story for yourself.
I just want to take a minute. Like he's talking about a Lovecraftian story, and it's like, I understand that you should talk about things that influence this game, but to talk about this for 2.5 minutes when you could give like a really basic summary and then point people to read the actual book, right? Like, again, it feels like it's one of those things where he's indulging in he's making the video and indulging himself in his knowledge of H.P. Lovecraft because he likes that shit and he loves Bloodborne, so he feels this is the opportune time to gush. You know what I mean? It feels, I guess it feels excessively fanboyish at times for Lovecraftian stuff. And I get that you kind of have to mention it regarding this game, or it's a good idea to mention it just for like context of influence. But I do think talking about the game on its own would be more pure as a topic to discuss. But anyway, let's hear about the Shadow over Innsmouth.
Shadow over Innsmouth, where the townspeople of Innsmouth had for a long time been having talks with the sea-dwelling Deep Ones, and had made a pact with them long ago, where the Deep Ones would gift them gold, and keep the town's economy alive, and in exchange, the Deep Ones and the humans would interbreed and create immortal offspring.
The Deep Ones worshipped Dagon, an eldritch creature from the deep, and fun fact, most fishing hamlet enemy AI scripts refer to the fishmen as Deep Ones, followed by a description of who they are. So Deep Ones A, Deep Ones B, Deep Ones Big No Weapon, Deep Dog, that sort of stuff. And just like in the story it's based on, the villagers here aren't fussed about their appearance. However, whereas in Lovecraft's writings, the horror is in discovering that these things existed, Bergenworth was ecstatic to find these people, and not only did they not feel any sense of disgust from seeing them, but rather they believed these fish people were to be studied because they were kin to the Great Ones. The way this happens seems to be because of the parasites of Cause. So, in Japanese culture, there is the idea of a whale savior, where a whale would be beached near a starving village, and the villagers would eat it and store its bones for worship as repayment for it having delivered itself to save the town. That seems to be where the idea of Cause being beached comes from. That these villagers beckoned Cause maybe to revive their fishing industry, like in Shadow over Innsmouth, and if so, judging by the amount of fish we see here, it worked. But additionally, Cause carried parasites with it, which are phantasms. Remember when we talked about vermin versus phantasms? That's what Berkenworth likely saw in the hamlet. Instead of beasts, people were becoming something greater. The villagers might have been ingesting the parasites, or maybe just contact with the parasite transformed them. And as you might imagine, Bergenworth wanted very much to study these things, so they sent their hunters here to eradicate the town. The heads of the inhabitants were drilled into to search for eyes on the inside, which is where the accursed brew item comes from. And at some point, whether they knew of Cause before coming or only learned about it after, they eventually found Cause, killed it, and ripped its stillborn child out of her to study. From that child's corpse, they obtained the first umbilical cord, the one used to ascend Rom. Back in Canehurst, I made a point of reiterating the lore from that area. Back in Canehurst, I made a...
He did upgrade it. Why'd you say it was going to be unupgraded? What the fuck? It's like 2 off. That's not a big deal. Again, why are you going to mention something if it doesn't actually come into effect? I'm sorry, I'm just like, why? Why?
A point of reiterating the lore from that area, even though I didn't really go anywhere with it. The reason
He just admitted that he didn't really go anywhere with a point he made earlier.
For that was that I wanted to have some evidence to stand on when I say I think the church genocide to fetch an infant Great One story was repurposed for the fishing hamlet.
That it may have been a big plot point, but
as Canehurst became less and less relevant for the main game, assuming it was once mandatory, it got stripped out along with most of Canehurst and eventually made its way here. Alternatively, the reason it's so seemingly underdeveloped in Canehurst might be because Miyazaki realized that he was striking real gold with it, and he felt it deserved a better showcase, so he saved it for the DLC. Now, this story is technically in Canehurst still, but things like the choir being transformed into executioners just a few weeks before the game released, things like much of Canehurst being a bit gutted content-wise, and things like Queen Annalise being the original model for the doll, all point me to think that, yeah, Miyazaki wanted to do this idea of a church-led genocide and murder of a Great One justice in a bit grander scope. Like he thought this should be its own story rather than be a sidetrack in this bigger one. So they might have stripped out as much as they needed to, or might have just left it intentionally underdeveloped so that they could make it the central point of the DLC.
This is the last time we'll be talking to Simon, and it's fitting that in his death, he introduces us to another NPC who functions not dissimilarly from himself, except that he's hostile. Introduces is not the right word, though, because we've actually been introduced to Brador. We met him in the cells connected to the underground corpse pile, but Simon is how the game introduces us to Brador proper. Simon is a likable character who did a lot to direct the DLC and imbue it with intrigue, so players will likely have grown to like him at this point. And Brador, killing him off like this, should be enough to get players against him, but just for good measure, he's going to invade us over and over again and try to kill us to prevent us from uncovering the church's secrets. Now, I am aware that I keep introducing new standards to evaluate NPCs on just so that I can place the next one on a very specific sort of pedestal, but Brador is my favorite NPC in the game, full stop.
Okay, so he admits he's had a shifting standard the entire video. It's usually not a good thing to have, period, let alone to admit it. But let's hear what he has to say about this Brador.
Brador is my favorite NPC in the game, full stop. Not my favorite design-wise, that's still Simon. I like Brador's role in the world, but Simon's placement and role in telling the story are just such good craft that even Brador takes the backseat for me. But rather, Brador is just my favorite NPC, hands down. I think he embodies the best of everything NPCs can bring to the experience, and I think his character goes a long way to hammer home the point of the DLC, as well as to tidy up a bit of lore inconsistencies from the base game.
I like how he's talking all this stuff about Brador. It's like we have not seen him since the last time you mentioned him. Like in the Yharnam Nightmare, like in the lower hall area or wherever it was. You're talking about an NPC and building him up so big when we don't see him on the screen right now. It's like, show some footage of him.
See, in the base game, when we will come to fight Gurman, he will seemingly become a young man again for that fight, but what actually happens is just that his face is getting stretched over the face of another character. Brador shows us that this is actually in keeping with the lore, because in the dreams, people aren't as tethered to their age as they are in the waking world. The Brador who invades us is much younger than the Brador in the cell. Anyways, things I like about Brador, he provides another side to the mission which Simon set up, and explores the idea of someone who does not believe that the hunters deserve peace. To that end, he hunts down anyone who seeks to end the nightmare. He's not the hardest enemy in the game or anything, but he can be very difficult, so you get the sense that he's serious about stopping you. Going back to our talk about the Buddhist hell, the villagers here have many attacks which the Hell Scrolls explicitly state to be tortures which Hell's inhabitants must face. Of note is the cleaver-wielding enemy whose grab attack has him continually smash his cleaver into our face, the spearmen who skewer the player, the rakemen who scrape at the player, the Molotov throwers who burn the players, and the witches who summon vengeful spirits to attack the players.
I wonder if this is leading into more like Brador shit or whatever, but he talked about this guy being his favorite NPC. Haven't heard the NPC talk besides way earlier in the DLC. He pops up, Acer murks him, like absolutely murks him, and then we're just moving on from that. Like, if you want to talk about your favorite NPC, talk about him and like show us examples of why he's your favorite other than just saying, I just like him. It's like he's not qualifying what he's saying with this Brador thing. And it's like, why do you call him I know that technically all things besides the player are NPCs, but why do you call him your favorite NPC if you met him in a room, didn't talk to him that much, and then you go out, he gets killed by Simon, but you don't see it, and then he invades you a couple times. Like, is there dialogue that I'm just not aware of that makes his story interesting, or does he just appear like a dickhead and just fight you a lot? Because that seems to be what it is. It's just weird. Yeah, that's something I was going to bring up, Andrew, was just, you could talk about Solaire or Sigmire. Hell, like Henri. You know, Henri and Horace. You know, Hawkwood. Just like, there are so many more NPCs you could talk about, but he's just, this one's my favorite. Moving on. It's like, talk about them. Talk about the game. Please talk about the game and what's in the game and how it works in the game. Quit talking about this outside game bullshit. I don't care about like Buddhism. I care about the fucking game.
I might be a bit generous with my reading here, and I'll note that many of these attacks are present in other Souls games which seem to not draw on the Hell Scrolls, but I thought I should note this anyway. And while I was at it, I also thought that I should note this Hell Scroll I found depicting Patches poking the messengers with a stick. Jerk. On a serious note though, the piled up stones are what I wanted to note. The environmental design of the fishing hamlet draws somewhat on the end of Jigoku, a movie about sinners who enter hell in the third act, where the main character is running between the hells searching for his child and gets to witness the multitudes of tortures of hell. In that movie, they note that the piled up stones, piled up shells in the fishing hamlet, are laid for someone left behind. So, assumably these rocks were piled up here by the fishmen to mourn those they could not bury. That movie also has a limbo for children who die, which is visualized as a beach bathed in blue light. And yes, the protagonist of that movie is also led through his adventure at the end by listening to the cries of an infant. The visual design of the fishing hamlet seems to draw on Jugoku, what with the blue, but the DLC draws on the Hell Scrolls for many of its individual set pieces. The first thing you encounter in Hell is a mirror which reveals all of your wrongdoings in life, and I think this might be what the amygdalas are ultimately supposed to be. They're like judges who decide whether or not an individual is sinful, and the way they see that is by observing the player's inventory. That we had a tonsil stone meant that we carried some sort of sin, which meant penance in the nightmare frontier. And that we carried the eye of a blood-drunk hunter meant the amygdala saw us as deserving of penance in the hunter's nightmare. Another notable set piece was the River of Filth and Blood. In the Hell Scrolls, it is explained that those who shed blood on the ground are performing a type of ritual pollution, and in Hell would be drowned over and over again in a massive pool of blood and filth. The idea with the blood is that it disrupts the flow. So imagine if you wash blood-stained clothes in a river. That
I don't know how long we're going to be here, but he's talking a lot about just like random Buddhism stuff that may or may not relate to this. So I'm probably just going to be kind of quiet and just let him do his thing.
river is now tainted, and anyone who makes, say, a cup of tea from it, which they will drink while celebrating the Buddha, are tainting their celebration. I note here that a central image of the Nightmare Frontier were the crawlers dragging themselves through a lake of filth, so even there the connection seems to hold. Images of beasts being pummeled into the ground by blood-drunk hunters in the beginning of the DLC are reminiscent of many of the crushing punishments doled out in Hell, and Braydor's Testament brings up the idea of flogging. The Hell Scrolls seem to be where much of the DLC spawned from. Not everything is one-to-one. I'll note that Ludwig is both torturer and being tortured, but that seems more like ideas are being squished together to me. Of the human bosses in this DLC, all of them have their minds somewhat fractured. Ludwig is torn between man and beast. Maria is split between the vengeful woman in the astral clock tower and the doll, and Lawrence had his mind taken away from him.
We know from the accursed brew that the hunters went inside the heads of the fishmen to look for eyes on the inside, so it's possible that the punishment is meant to fit the crime. Bergenworth invaded the thoughts of the fishmen, so the nightmare uses the minds of the Bergenworthers to assault them. Braydor's invasions are triggered by the player entering certain areas, so he incentivizes careful play, and because he respawns endlessly, that is, killing him in one area in the fishing hamlet will not prevent him from respawning to fight you in that area again if you die. Because he respawns endlessly, he does what so many other NPCs tried and I think failed to. He incentivizes for us to go back to a previous area.
Why though? Like, why does he? Like, what is the point of going back to the area if he reappears? Like over and over. Like, why would we go back to that area to fight him, to interact with him again? Like, what would be the point? Like, if he drops a new item each time, and you need a certain amount of that item to do something, or a certain set of items to do something, yeah, that could be one thing. But I mean, you just made it sound like you just get his set slowly by killing him over and over. Again, like, this is an NPC that he says was his favorite, full stop. I don't know why. It's like, I don't get it.
He does what so many other NPCs tried and I think failed to. He incentivizes for us to go back to a previous area. If we kill Braydor in the cells connected to the underground corpse pile, his phantom stops invading us. Alfred and Eileen's quest both have material rewards at the end, which you can argue are worth the loading screens it takes to get to advance their quests. But I think Braydor's quest is a notch above theirs in that the material reward is connected to the area, which gives Braydor a sort of presence I feel is absent in most of the NPCs in the main game. And finally, if all of this wasn't enough to tip him over the edge for you, consider that he has the craziest weapon in the game in the Bloodletter. Not the best one, not even close, though it can squeak out some online victories, but arguably the most interesting weapon design-wise, because it constantly drains health, costs a lot of health to transform, so you need to dedicate yourself to each transformation somewhat, and it can cause an AoE explosion which frenzies you. I consider Simon to be better threaded into the game since he's more integral to the storytelling of the DLC and has a more important role than Braydor's. That said, I do consider Braydor to be the pinnacle of Bloodborne's NPC design. His placements, like Simon's, congeal exactly with how the game is played. Actually, a bit better in the sense that I've never seen the game fail to load him. The difference is that he's not here for chit chat, he's here to kill. Final note on.
I mean, doesn't that kind of impact the NPC story when they don't interact with you at all? Like, part of the reason we love Solaire and Sigmire and Henri and all these other ones is because we interact with them regularly. They appear throughout the world to do something with us. You know, it's not like this guy who says, "Do you hear the bell?" And when you say yes, you're like, he's like, liar. You know, and then you go and get invaded by him a whole bunch of times. Then you come back and he says, "Well, you here to kill me? I'm gonna kill you too." It's like, what's interesting about that? It's like the gear lore for everybody is interesting in different ways, right? He's not special. He just invades you a lot. It's like a player could do that. Like, I don't get it's like I don't get what he's talked a lot about how like this dude's quest line has this dude's like interactions have him invading you a lot and you get his gear and then you get a really weird freaky weapon from him and it's like what's the point? Like like why do you like him as an NPC? It seems like you just like that he breaks up some monotony of fighting regular enemies. Like it's not like you like him as an NPC, it's like you like him as a change of pace in terms of going through the world. That's what it sounds like.
Braydor, while he empties out his dialogue, I think he is supposed to be Gozu. I noted earlier that Ludwig is seemingly based on the character Meizu, who guards the entrance to hell as well as serving as one of its chief torturers, Gozu is his partner in those tasks. Mezu is a man with the head of a horse, so Ludwig, Gozu is a man with the head of an ox. Brador's outfit is the foreigner's set we began the game with, except it's drenched in the blood of the skinned cleric beast he wears on his head. Apparently, that cleric beast and him were friends prior to the friend turning, and I think the horns on the headset are supposed to evoke the image of an ox.
And there we go. That's the end of that dude's interaction. Unless he comes back later, but holy shit. I don't think you could do a better way to make him look worse without outright lying. And he might be lying, I don't know. Like I said, I didn't play through much of the DLC more than like once or twice, like maximum. So like I'm not, it's just the way he made that scene. Like if you're going to illustrate why something's your favorite, you should try to think about those arguments and think about how to persuade people to your perspective other than just saying, I like him because he appears and invades. I like him because he references a Buddhist thing outside of the game. It's like, it's not that deep. That doesn't really compel me to like seek out his story. It's like I more so want to look it up just to see if you're wrong, just to see if like you've actually talked about everything involving him, or if this is just a I liked him because he invaded me a lot and did it with a smirk on his face. Like I don't get it. I don't get a lot of things that of the why in this video by Acer. I really don't.
I know that it looks a bit more like an elk or maybe deer, but considering how close Brador is placed next to Ludwig, how both of them are essentially placed near the entrance to hell, considering that his role given to him by the church is to prevent snooping eyes from uncovering their secret, and considering that he's literally a man with the head of an animal, not the exact one Gozu had, but still, I think it sort of fits that he and Ludwig are Gozu and Mezu. Alternatively, the Hell Scrolls also talk about figures known as the Wuchang Ghosts. Two characters, one dressed in white, the other dressed in black. The white one is a fortune deity who rewards people for their good deeds and whose Chinese name can be interpreted as those who make amends will always be at peace. And the black one is a malevolent deity who punishes those who commit evil and whose name can be interpreted to mean those who commit crime will have no salvation.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I've been saying, Vic, is he's extremely subjective in the way he talks about things he likes about this game and the context or what appears to be context around it, whether it's true or not. Right? It's just very it's just weird. Like I can tell you exactly like a good example for me of explaining something subjective that I like, right? Like I love the live action Transformers films. I think they're really fun, right? Are they well written? No, not really. Right? Do they have problems? Yeah, absolutely. But I like them for a lot of the interesting world building that they try to do, right? With the Transformers and the way they work and the way that their stories intermingle and the way their lore kind of compounds as the movies go along, right? Like I like them, right, for that, and I like the way the bots interact with each other and the action sequences, and plus the CGI is top notch, right? I like them for that, but you're not going to catch me saying that all of the stories are extremely compelling and super emotional and you can insert yourself into them. It's like, no, that's not what it is. It's like, I'll be honest in saying that I like them for the aesthetic and the details in the sort of construction of the Transformers race and their stories, but all the other shit on top of it are problematic and weigh it down. I can explain why I like something, right? Whereas he just seems to think is like, this thing is amazing. This is how it works. Don't you intrinsically know why it's amazing now? It's like, you didn't explain why it's amazing. You just told me it does a thing, and then you said it's amazing. That doesn't mean it's amazing, right? Like, you need to connect the two.
If Praetor is this black Wuchang ghost, if he is Fan Wu Jiu, perfect pronunciation, then it's possible that Simon is meant to be the white Wuchang ghost. At least the interpretations of their names would seem to align perfectly with their individual motivations, I think. We are making our way to the final boss of this area. This is, of course, the Orphan of Chaos. And I just want to note that
Okay, here we go. I think yep, here we go. We're getting to cost now. So let's buckle up and wait for the riveting boss lore dump, and then the 5 seconds talking about his moveset's hard. And then we move on to something else. Seriously, his commentary about bosses has been extremely underwhelming throughout most of this video. And if I really wish that Sheep was here, because I know I don't know if it's a he or she, but I know they wanted to really look at this fight and just really hope that it's not underwhelming. Although they did look at it, and I asked them not to spoil it for me, so I think I'm about to be disappointed yet again.
I really like the placement of the snail women here. They seem to be in prayer, so to me, it comes across as they are trying to soothe the orphan's wrath or are mourning cause. In any case, the boss arena comes across as a sort of sacred area, so it makes sense that the orphan is born once we enter. We sully the sacredness with our hunter selves, and so the full wrath of the nightmare's origin comes to us personally. The orphan cries once it looks at the sky, and the crying is the same audio as Gurman's cry, which can be heard when he sleeps, except the orphan's is pitched down a bit. But that is not the extent to which the orphan borrows from Gurman. Both of them have a sort of flowing cape dealie going on, made of what looks like torn fabric. They are about as tall in the fights, the first half of the orphan's fight at least, and they wield similar blades. I think the idea here is that Gurman killed Kaz and ripped out its child, and that the wrath of Kaz is manifested as a twisted version of Gurman. The orphan is easily the hardest boss in the game, but once you get the hang of things, there are some fairly straightforward fundamentals which will do most of the heavy lifting of carrying you through this fight. For one, dash to his left. Second, don't get greedy. The orphan can be stunned, but so can you, and he can roll over you in just a couple of hits. It's also prudent to fight him in the ocean rather than on the beach. It's a completely flat surface, so you don't need to worry about any elevation-based shenanigans doing you in, and there's no clutter there, like the walls on the beach, so there's nothing to get snagged on. Additionally, the orphan likes to fly around the map, and if you're in the ocean, he'll fly further away from you, because he isn't blocked by the walls. It's also further away from Kaz's corpse, which is relevant because during the fight, the Orphan of Kaz transforms and can summon lightning waves which originate from Kaz's corpse.
See, he's actually talking about the fight. He's actually talking about it. I'm actually kind of surprised. He's actually talking about mechanics. It's nice. Just wanted to mention that.
The transformation is triggered once the boss's health bar reaches a certain threshold, and the way this works under the hood is a good example of how game design is more about being economic than anything else, because the alternate form of the orphan is already loaded into the map. It's probably just locked underneath the surface or something. And the orphan itself gets swapped out when the transformation happens, with the swap being masked by the large explosion of smoke. This same animation trick applies to weapon transformations as well, with weapons seemingly having a small window where they actually get stretched a bit before the new weapon is spawned in its place. Likewise, we saw this technique used for Gascoigne and the Beggar. The reason this is done rather than the boss just having one model which transforms is because it's just easier. And once you start to dig under the hood of games, you'll find a lot of cases where this sort of stuff is done. We look at the characters, bosses, and areas in these games as the individuals which they are, but As I already explained with the way this game transforms levels by literally warping them out for the same level differently lit and decorated, the magic is in the illusion. You believe that the transformed orphan is the same entity, and so the illusion is maintained. If I made the surface transparent and let you see the other model while you fought this guy, assuming that the other model is located right underneath the surface, that illusion would be broken. Games are not reality simulators, so they can get away with breaking the rules like this. And considering how much duct tape and glue there is behind the scenes of games, it'd be a ridiculous ask for the game to prioritize realism. What we see in game is very rarely close to being how the game gets about displaying it. You might think that warping between areas would just take the player from one area to the next. But under the hood, the game needs to freeze all of your inputs in the middle of the teleportation animation so that you don't do something stupid while it happens. It needs to dump everything in the level out of memory, which makes me think that the changes which are carried over between warps like bosses and NPC stories are actually not checked by localized objects but rather global ones, since NPCs carry over between the maps being swapped around. Anyways, the game needs to dump the held map out of the memory, find the map you teleported to, build that map, drop your player at the designated coordinates, play the arrival animation, and then give you control of the character again. I'm assuming that the game never actually dumps the player character out of memory, since I don't think it needs to. But if that's the case, then the game must also turn on invincibility frames during the teleportation in case an enemy snacks in a hit right before being dumped out of the memory. Alternatively, the game freezes itself once the loading screen comes up so that enemies don't hit you or kill your NPCs, and the game must then also make the player character invisible, only to become seeable again after the teleportation. This isn't even going into the animations which the game needs to call on for effects. This assumes that the game isn't rebuilding the player character at every load, and it also assumes that NPCs are stored as global variables, which every room can use, rather than as local ones, where different rooms which are used as the same area at different times have the same room objects as their alternate versions. On top of that, this is also assuming that the game has rooms, rather than just building everything from some massive data pool.
Why is he talking about warping mechanics? I don't think he's really talking about warping mechanics. I think he's just talking about every damn aspect of filtering things in and out of a game seamlessly. And it's like, this feels like a weird place to put that talk. It's like you're talking about one of the most popular like bosses in the game. It's like, talk about the boss some more. I don't get it. I don't get it. I think he just wants to. Again, I think this video is sort of a filter for him to siphon out all the things that he wants to talk about Bloodborne, specifically like lore, the context to how it was made, and like details about the production process. I feel like this isn't really a Bloodborne analysis or commentary as much as it is a making of Bloodborne commentary and analysis, right? Like it doesn't feel like it's like we've gotten 6 hours and almost 20 minutes through, and he's talked about a lot of backstage stuff, a lot of contextual, like influential stuff, right? It's like he's talked more about stuff behind the game than the stuff actually in the game, and it's really kind of grating on the experiences because, like, some people will find game production interesting, right? Like, I think some of the stuff he's talking about is interesting, but I don't want to talk about that in a video titled Bloodborne Analysis Full Commentary. I expect you to talk about Bloodborne and analyze Bloodborne, the game, not the production, right? Like, I think that if this video was titled differently, I would have a different opinion. You know, like calling it Bloodborne a production analysis and commentary would go a much farther way in terms of making this video come across better, because he's talking a lot about like behind the scenes stuff and like ideological like influence stuff, And it's like, talk about the fucking game. And it's like he has sometimes here and there, but a lot of it's like behind the scenes shit. And it's like, while the behind the scenes shit can be cool, you still need to talk about the fucking game, especially when he just breezes over things that are worth discussing, like ROM, like talking about different aspects of the mechanics of certain boss fights as opposed to just mentioning them briefly and then going over the metaphorical references of this and this and this that match up with this story from some cultural thing. It's like, can we please just talk about the fucking game? Can we just stay on the game and talk about the game? It's like every once in a while bring in something that's outside of the game, like in terms of the production or the influence or whatever. But please just let us talk about the fucking game.
I'm guessing it has rooms or something approximating that, because it seems like the more intuitive way to construct a game like this, but I haven't gone under the hood, so I might be wrong. All of this just to go from one lantern to another. And yes, kiddos, this is what game design looks like, considering the tiny little details pertaining to how every interaction works with every other one is like half of the job. The other half is watching Frasier or something while you doodle some pixel art. The beach area is an interesting can of worms on its own, because back when this was theoretically a continuation of Demon's Souls, a beach area would not have been a dumb place for that game to end. We would go through the Chalice dungeons, assumably discover Boletaria or the Nexus or something, and then we have an area in the game which is just a beach, which would assumably be the one from the ending of Demon's Souls. We don't know exactly when Bloodborne stopped being a continuation of Demon's Souls' world. Miyazaki claims it never was, but we found way too many suspect pieces of geometry and item description to take that account as credible.
Okay, the little bit he just said about Demon Souls and like this game being built as sort of a Demon Souls continuation or something, when the director of the game says that it was not meant to be that, he's probably telling the truth, because why would he lie about that? Right, first off. But also, this studio recycles shit all the fucking time, right? Look, if you look at Elden Ring, you will notice so much shit from the other games if you have played them in Elden Ring, right? This studio loves recycling stuff, and it's not a bad idea, right? Recycling animations, move sets, all that shit. It's probably why their productions are able to come out fairly quickly. It's because they can get them out in a couple years, or even less, depending on the game, because they have so many ideas to build off of because they recycle shit all the time, right? It's not, if I had to say it, I think From Software are a grade A example of how to recycle things where you can still do something interesting with it, where it's not just copy and paste. They add on to the thing that they've copy and pasted and make it more unique, as opposed to just having the same shit again, but the texture is different. It's like there are changes, and I think you can applaud them for that, but I don't think this whole Demon Souls connection is as again. I don't think this connection is as deep as it goes. I think Acer is one of those people that reads into a lot of the shit that the production people do. Like, he reads into it, and I think he goes farther than necessary. And I think that's the biggest, one of the bigger issues about talking about these games is, let's talk about what we have, not what we don't, and not what we supposedly should have had. Right? I think we should talk about what we do have, because that's what we have. Anyway, we're almost near the end of the DLC, funnily enough, so we'll see how this all wraps up.
Although it's possible that in the context of saying this wasn't a continuation from Demon's Souls, Miyazaki might have been asked if this was Demon's Souls 2, which it wasn't. By all accounts, it was just a continuation from Demon's Souls, as in it just took place in the same universe.
So a sequel, right? Like, what is this hairy fairy like narrative BS talking about this. Like, what the what the fuck? Like, what the hell? It's like, if it takes place in the same universe, like, it is a part of that universe. Then it is a sequel, right? It's like this is one thing. Is like, take the MCU for example. It's like you have the Iron Man movies and then you have the Captain America movies, right? They're not sequels to each other, but they're sequels in the universe. Like, they are another movie in the universe that is the MCU. If this is in the same universe as Demon Souls, it would be a sequel. Like, what's this hairy fairy like what the fuck are you talking about? I gotta back that up just to get it again. Just
This
holy
wasn't
shit.
a continuation from Demon Souls. Miyazaki might have been asked if this was Demon Souls 2, which it wasn't. By all accounts, it was just a continuation from Demon Souls, as in it just took place in the same universe.
What the fuck?
Demon Souls is not a game which needs a sequel, and it also seems to me like Boletaria being a twist reveal just doesn't do the game before that justice. Like playing this gothic, cosmic, Lovecraftian horror action game, and then discovering that, whoa, it's an extension of the first one, the one you all liked so much. Like that doesn't do it for me. That doesn't feel like that would be rewarding for the players, but that it was a continuation of Demon Souls in some capacity is almost certain, considering some of the data mined content that has been found.
Do you want to show us some of this data mine content other than just randomly saying it? Like, substantiate what you're fucking talking about, man. Like, this has similar mechanics, some similar conceptual ideas, right? It's like it's got some similar ideas to Demon Souls. That doesn't mean that it's a sequel to Demon Souls, right? That doesn't mean it's a continuation of Demon Souls, right? Like, Dark Souls is a spiritual successor to Demon Souls, and that's the most honest way to put it. Like, it takes a lot of ideas from Demon Souls. This would be a spiritual successor to Dark Souls or Demon Souls, like either of them. Like, what's with this grammar? Why are we talking using these words? It's just overly confusing when it doesn't have to be.
Also, Dark Souls 3 made a big deal about players returning to Anor Londo, so, considering Miyazaki likes to cannibalize himself, maybe a literal return to the beach from Demon Souls wouldn't be that ridiculous a proposition. Regardless, I'm happy that Bloodborne is its own title. I know people out there like to have their theories about how the worlds are all actually linked, and I don't mind that, but it always seems to me like it makes each work a little less impressive because the world around it becomes so small. Once I've lifted the curse, the doll will note that Gurman sleeps sounder. Knowing his role in all of this, you can debate with yourself whether you think he actually deserves sound rest, but it's interesting here that if you decide to not soothe Gurman and the other hunters for their crimes, you can still fight the Orphan of Kos boss. The Nightmare Slain message does not appear until you destroy the little shadow effigy it leaves behind, so you're not locked out of fighting all the bosses in the game just because you might not want to save the old hunters, which I think is a nice touch. As you can see, I decided to go ahead with lifting the curse, cause not my child he killed, not my grudge to hold.
Ah, sweet child of Kos, returned to the ocean. A bottomless curse, a bottomless sea, accepting of all that there is and can be.
With the DLC out of the way, we can now go to the Nightmare of Menses and prepare to close down this experience.
Oh man, we're so close to the end. We're so close. We're about an hour left. I'm gonna keep going, but like, holy shit. I'm ready for this to be over, to be honest. It's not fun anymore. It's just kind of sitting here going, what the fuck are you talking about? Every stream. It's just damn.
I'm back at the Menses ritual site where I was when I killed the one reborn earlier. And I'll be entering the Nightmare of Menses through the lecture hall building, just like I did when I went to the Nightmare Frontier, which means we get to meet with our friend Patches again. He does the usual Patches stick, sorry, didn't mean to kill you, don't kill me, I'll be your friend, etc. Now, Patches can appear in the Chalice dungeons, so technically speaking, he is the only NPC merchant in the entire game. But I won't be going to see him there, so I have no reason whatsoever not to take this guy out. He doesn't actually pose any more threat to me, so I might deal with the scenario differently, but I find there's a sort of a reward to closing the questline out by killing him, regardless of the consequences and regardless of the material rewards. That might be because his quest offers some actual meat to it in the early access to the Nightmare Frontier
And the anti-clockwise metamorphosis rune.
and the reason resolving his quest doesn't grate on me, like the Erden Chapel Dwellers ones mostly do, is because I'm not going out of my way to meet Patches. He's a single ladder from the main path through the game anyway. You know my opinion on NPC locations in this game, so you know by now that I like this. I wonder though if Patches had gone back to the Forbidden Woods, if I'd even bother meeting him again. I imagine I would have in this playthrough since I went to the Forbidden Woods proper after the Nightmare Frontier, but something tells me that I wouldn't bother with him if that wasn't the case, even though he gifts us a really good rune. This all being said, I'm not killing Patches. I have nothing to say about the rest of the lecture building. It's just a wide area with rooms containing loot and lore which I've already dived into, so I'm going to be jumping straight into the Nightmare of Menses now.
There it goes again. Just like I'm going to forsake exploration, explaining items, explaining mechanics of enemies and stuff like that. I'm just going to forsake everything because there's no lore here. It's like, please. There's more to games than lore, man.
Mikalash is still a little ways away, so while I carefully dodge the frenzy beam of the brain of Menses and make my way towards him, I'm going to go over some of the mechanics which I didn't touch on in the video already.
Oh my god, he's making an announcement. I'm about to talk about mechanics. Please talk about something substantive, please.
Before I do, I want you to consider the praise I've showered the game with already, and I hope you agree with me that you can like a video game without thinking everything about it is great.
Why do we have to talk about this? Why?
I do consider Bloodborne to be one of the bright lights of the 8th generation of consoles, but I also think every game has its shortcomings, and that those are just as important to explore as what the game did well. You may disagree with me on some of what I'm about to say. In fact, I'm sure some of you will. But there's just no way of framing this talk otherwise than just hashing it out. Bloodborne is a transitionary piece, and so hosts certain translation misfires. For example, the storage mechanic is back from Demon Souls, but instead of impacting the experience, it's just sort of there. In Demon Souls, there was a cap to your carrying capacity, and you might genuinely have had to think about dumping some levels to increase that, because it limited the amount of resources you brought with you to an area. And since everything was an item back then, storage meant something, and resource management meant something as well. It got progressively less important on subsequent runs once you already knew what you were doing, but it served a function greater than just being where things are. Heads up to the arachnophobes watching, you may want to close your eyes.
This is one thing I actually like this area with all the spiders. I think spiders are a great mythical enemy to deal with, whether in a book, a game, a movie, anything. I think spiders are just naturally creepy as fuck. So making them giant and then putting them in a scenario is always fun.
having the storage mechanic, insofar as it means blood vials I pick up aren't lost in the world if my inventory is full. But that's actually another issue I have with it. Our vials and bullets refill on every warp, but not every other item does. So if the refilling was implemented out of convenience, it certainly didn't go far enough.
That's the thing I was going to say is I've been replaying Bloodborne like while I've been like streaming these things, not like during the streams, but it's like talking about this. Like I've had issues with Bloodborne where I try to like get my like Molotovs that I have in storage back, and it's like they just won't fucking load. Like instead of spawning in with the max I can carry on my person, I end up with like 6, and I have another 11 in storage that just will not get into my inventory. And it's like that's such a like the inventory management I think is one of the worst aspects of these games as it's gone on. And I really hate a lot of the like I really do hate the way they've implemented like managing certain things, like the limitation on how many arrows you can carry in Dark Souls 3, along with the limitations on what you can like physically hold on your body, like being capped at unreasonably low numbers, I think have been really bad for the games as a whole. Because I would love to do like bow only runs, right? But if you play Dark Souls 3 or on, you're shit out of luck, man. It's really hard to get those things to work without doing crazy infa level shit. It's like you're destroying a build when you do that shit, and it seems like they're destroying builds just to make the games harder. And it's like, can you fuck off with that, please? Let me have my bow build. It's just it seems counterintuitive. That's annoying. Like the frostbite spiders in Skyrim. Yes. Those fuckers are also creepy, which I touch on in my videos. Shameless plug.
Another carryover design decision relates back to what I said about inventory being capped by your levels, and that is that this is a game where you upgrade levels, but aside from Arcane, and even then, those levels are mostly relevant for combat. The Souls games never had really deep character interactions or integration of exploration to the levels or anything like that.
What the fuck? Okay, he better be leading somewhere with these points, because if he's not, he's just outright lying. Like, he is just outright lying. All right, what the fuck is he saying right here?
This is a game where you upgrade levels, but aside from Arcane, and even then, those levels are mostly relevant for combat. The Souls games never had really deep character interactions or integration of exploration to the levels or anything like that, but there were at least some considerations baked into the levels to incorporate them as such. Here, aside from Arcane, and even then, the only reason to level up is for the combat.
Okay, I think he's talking about it in the context of combat, which kind of makes sense, because, I mean, this is a combat-heavy series. Like, you need combat to win the game. So, duh. I'm not sure where he's going with this.
Now, I get
Also, completely wasted those little shaman dagger things. Those things are incredibly useful, and you wasted them on fucking spiders.
that the game originally had more systems to juggle the world with, so this might have played really well in some earlier build. But after those got ripped out, the combat and leveling are sort of left propping up more of the experience than I think they are ultimately able to without straining. This might be an observation which can only exist in hindsight, since I've seen Sekiro branch out further from Souls and put some unique spin on things.
I mean, this is one thing where a lot of stats do deal with combat, but some of them don't. Like dexterity, has been a thing that is used to, it limits your fall damage to a certain extent depending on the game you're in, right? And health just means you can take more damage before you die. That's not necessarily just for combat, right? Stamina, more stamina can be incredibly helpful, for, running farther. That's not necessarily just combat either. FP in later games, You know, you can use that for utility purposes, you know, like being able to, you know, reduce fall damage and utility natures like that, produce light. You know, it's like these, there have been stats that have been useful for things outside of combat before, but because these are combat heavy games, they will naturally have more uses for combat. This is just a, I don't really understand where he's going with this whole conversation. Like, it just, again, he's talking about like behind the scenes stuff about levels doing something other than combat related things. It's like, yeah, they have existed to be able to do things that are not combat related, but I mean, these are combat heavy games. Everything should be able to help you with combat in some way, you know, unless it needs to do something specific. It's just, he's always making weird points.
Some I liked, some I didn't. But I actually remember coming from Dark Souls being a bit underwhelmed by the exploration in this game when it first came out, even though I realized that the level layouts were some of the most impressive FromSoft had ever assembled. Arachnophobes can open their eyes again, by the way.
One thing I want to say though about this whole spider thing he just did, he picked the worst possible way to fight these spiders other than just throwing rocks at them. Like, that combat strategy was fucking terrible. You're going to waste expensive like daggers that turn like basically enemies into like third party attackers that will attack anything, right? You waste them on fucking spiders when you can lead all the small spiders into this little area, slap them down while the big one is stuck inside the room, right? Like, there are obvious bottleneck strategies available here. And instead you waste precious resources. Like, why, again, just why do you play this game the way that you play it? Like, I gotta wonder, man. It's just, you play Bloodborne weird. It's like you play games weird.
The issue I had then was that the levels were not really places to explore anymore. Rather, they were places where you fought enemies. The early game kind of locks you on a certain build path, so even going
Certain build path, even though this game is free of builds.
The early game kind of locks you on a certain build path, so even going out of your way to collect items is not as incentivized as in Souls. If you disagree with that, consider that in the spider fight, I used the Shaman Bone Blade, which I picked up in that room. It's one of the most entertaining items to use as it turns enemies to friends, but that room was the only area in the game where this item can be found, with the exception of being a drop from brain suckers, like we saw.
That's actually factually wrong. I've encountered some just sitting. Now, they are rare, but I've picked some of those up in my playthrough, right, without going to these spiders, right? That's just factually wrong. You can pick up a couple of these little shaman bone things around, right? And you can also buy them after a certain point too. So it's not like they're completely, you know, only droppable. But, and they are fun to mess with. It's just the way he chose to do that fight bothers me with how much he just, if you wanted to explain those things, I would have used them. What I would have done is I would have tried to use one of them on the dude in the hallway after the spiders and then have him run in there and fight the spiders. See, that would have been interesting. That would have been kind of fun. Create some sort of dynamic as opposed to just dodging spiders as much as possible and then just trying to get them to fight each other when you can slap most of them down pretty easily. It's just a waste of resources and time, in my opinion, the way he did it.
Item can be found, with the exception of being a drop from brain suckers, like we saw in Bergenworth. How on earth it was decided to keep this item from the players until the last level of the game and then only make the item purchasable after the player acquires a certain chalice dungeon boggles my mind. And
okay, I think he's making a point off of something he got wrong to begin with. So, all right, let me look up the Bloodborne wiki real quick and just look for the Shaman Bone thingy, whatever it's called. Shaman Bone Blade. All right. Let's see here. Let's see. Oh, wait. On the wiki, it says you can only get them from the Nightmare of Mensis. I picked some up, like off of... okay, let me clarify this. I think I may have picked one up off of a brain sucker after I killed it. Maybe I didn't pick it up. That's my bad. That's my bad. I mean, they are kind of an overpowered item to a certain extent. So I can kind of see where, even though I was wrong about him being wrong, I do think that them being locked behind some shit is reasonable given how overpowered they can be in the right situations.
I think it goes to what I'm saying about how the idea of rewarding exploration with new tactics or fringe items is diminished from previous games. And because the game isn't designed around backtracking, like Dark Souls was, you're not really getting to meet NPCs over and over again, so they fade into the background and don't serve as a big reason to explore either. This is admittedly subjective, and I imagine that there are viewers who really enjoyed the exploration in Bloodborne, not that I hate it or anything. But considering where it's coming from, I'd be lying if I said I was all that impressed. I suppose this is the curse of following two of the best games of the generation which preceded it. Bloodborne is just going to be scrutinized more than most games because it comes from better stock than most games do, after all. Going back to our talk on storage, items have been less and less the focus of these games as we drift further away from Demon's Souls. As I noted way back when I talked about healing, Demon's Souls had 5 areas and all had a central resource. That was Boletaria's grass for healing, Stonefang's ore for reinforcing weapons, Latria's spice to fuel magic, Shrine of Storms' souls for levels, and the Valley of Defilement's flowers to deal with status ailments. That wasn't the explicit point of any of the levels, but it made the experience more scriptable if players knew what they wanted. I've already talked about how Dark Souls detached the healing from the inventory with Estes, and I think overall that was a worthwhile experiment because it enabled FromSoft to make the experience a lot more independent and a lot less broken up. The reliance on items to guide the experience did slip though, or was still necessary for reinforcements, but there is no ore area in Dark Souls, so...
Well, yeah, because they don't need it, because certain enemies drop them at certain points in the game. This conversation about like Demon Souls having different areas produce different things for you, that's helpful to an extent, but when you have specific enemies that have a chance to drop things, or you have vendors that sell them and they're relatively cheap, you don't have to have the area restriction anymore. This is one thing where I feel like he's leading to say that Demon Souls did something really good that the other games didn't do, that they aren't doing as well, when I think it's actually the opposite, because I think he's missing the point that I'm making, which is just because there's no dedicated area for like magic dust, right? Or or like healing items or upgrade materials doesn't mean that the areas are worse for wear. If anything, they've incorporated them in a more reasonable manner in later games after Demon Souls, because you've had upgrade materials that have a chance to drop from certain enemies at certain points in the game, as well as vendors that sell them in reasonably easy to find locations, right? Like this isn't like, it's not like it's one thing where I wonder how he feels about farming in games in general, because in excuse me, in Dark Souls 1, if you wanted to, you could farm upgrade materials from specific enemies, right? Like Titanite shards, large Titanite shards, stuff like that. You could farm them from certain enemies, you know, but you didn't have to for some of those items, right? The Titanite shards and large Titanite shards, several vendors sell those, right? And they sell an infinite amount of them, and some of them do not move, right? So, I mean, it's not like you're completely locked out of upgrades. Now, the chunks are where the problems usually persist in Dark Souls, because, you know, you have to kill certain enemies to hope for a drop of them, you know, and there's no vendor that sells, you know, like enough of them, you know, for like a significant impact to the builds, you know, but you can still find enough by the end of the game to completely upgrade a weapon and, you know, farm some other things. And my question to Acer would be, How do you feel about farming in these games as a whole? Do you think farming adds to the experience, or do you think farming is a useless grind that can get in the way of things? Because I would like to see his perspective on that. Because I think that there is a reasonable amount of farming you should be able to do in a game like this, just like any other game that has, levels and upgrades and stuff like that. But I would wonder where he stands on farming as a mechanical aspect to games. Like if he thinks it's a great thing that more games should incorporate, if he thinks it depends on the game, or if he thinks it's a thing that slows down gameplay and progression and just wastes players' time. Like where does he stand on grinding the farm for resources, right? I would like to get a more deep opinion of his from there.
So players likely will just buy them from the vendors or use the ones they find passively while they go through the game.
Yeah, because we find them easily. We don't have to go to the area to farm things and then farm it. Especially when you have egregious loading times like Demon Souls in this game do.
The only other items to really guide the experience were the moss blossoms, mostly for convenience, the transient curses in one area, and the purging stones. Dark Souls made that trade-off to deliver on the lost in the world mood, and ultimately, I think it really pays off in that game. In comparison to these two, Bloodborne feels, to me, a bit confused in this regard. Aside from arcane builds, Bloodborne...
I always found the dog birds kind of funny. Just as kind of a random aside, I always found the dog birds to be kind of funny.
Game. In comparison to these two, Bloodborne feels, to me, a bit confused in this regard. Aside from arcane builds, Bloodborne rarely uses the items to direct the experience in any meaningful way, but it doesn't have a world for us to get lost in like Dark Souls did either. It's not broken up so that items can guide the experience like in Demon Souls, but it's also not interconnected and warp locked to make you get lost like it was in Dark Souls. So it's stuck in the middle, and items don't really manage to make all that big an impact. Now, not every mechanic needs to be the highlight of the core gameplay loop to warrant its inclusion. And it's not like I'd want the items we do have to be removed, so don't take this as items in Bloodborne bad, but it's another showcase of how the world design is more than just how the levels are laid out. If players can...
Well, yeah. Again, he's like bringing up straw man points to counteract. It's like, yeah, they're like the world, needs to be more thought out than just this is where the resources are. It's like, yeah.
Is more than just how the levels are laid out.
Yeah.
If players can always retreat to a central hub, they will navigate the world differently than if they actually had to walk around everywhere, and they will resort to valuing the mechanics on hand differently as they are more and less integral to a satisfying experience. Something I think Bloodborne did better than both Demon Souls and Dark Souls, however, was its New Game Plus. Not only can you start to finally experiment with the weapons you had, but you also get to revisit the game in proper context. Dark Souls...
So you can do that with every fucking From Software game? Like, dude, this is the biggest fuck you moment I've probably had in this video. It's like, Bloodborne does New Game Plus better because you get to go through the game with added context. It's like, fuck you, dude. Every fucking game they make, you can do that with. Okay, this is a point that's actually pissed me off. It's like, if you're trying to make Bloodborne seem special on this front, you are just a fucking shill for Bloodborne at this point. All the fucking games do this. Okay? Every one of their fucking games do this. Right? And it's part of the appeal of New Game Plus, is you get to go through and re-experience things with the knowledge of why they are the way they are. Every one of these fucking games has that. Bloodborne's not fucking special because of this shit, right? And unless he makes a point, saying that all the other games do it, I'm gonna assume that he's just letting his bias he's just flopping his bias out. And I'm gonna fucking cut it off because fucking shit, man, that is a terrible way to juxtapose Bloodborne compared to the other ones. All the games can do that. What the hell? I mean, DS2 is the only FromSoft game that actually changes things each New Game Plus cycle. Yeah, I mean that's one thing that Dark Souls 2 has over all of the other games. You know, now there are some things that you can get in New Game Plus, like you can get a couple of rings in like Dark Souls like 3 that are like upgraded versions. You know, like you can get the plus like 1s and 2s and 3s, or some plus 1s, 2s, and 3s in New Game Plus in other games. But that's not as much of a change as having more enemies and a redistribution of enemies and extra enemies, right? Dark Souls 2 does, I think, have more in New Game Plus than all the other games do in New Game Plus. Now, that doesn't make it a better experience, in my opinion. You know, those are separate things. But it is a thing where like Dark Souls 2 does have more unique shit in New Game Plus than Bloodborne. You know, but anyway, let's get back to this point that pissed me off. And let's re-experience it.
Than both Demon Souls and Dark Souls, however, was its New Game Plus. Not only can you start to finally experiment with the weapons you had, but you also get to revisit the game in proper context.
The mimics in DS2 fucked me at first with the change placements I could appreciate. Yeah. Well, that's one thing is like once you know where things like mimics and other traps are, the game becomes like knowing where shit is part of the fun of replaying these games, is when you know things are out there. And this is one thing that actually really bothered me about Scholar of the First Sin. Scholar took out a lot of fucking mimics in the game. Like a lot of mimics. Like a lot of them just straight up disappeared. And that's something that I found really weird, is like why they took out the mimics. Maybe it's because people complained about them, but I mean, they complained about a lot of stuff that they left in the game or doubled down on. So why would you remove the mimics? I don't know. The mimics in Dark Souls 2 are just weird from top to bottom. Placement, way they designed them, way their hitboxes work, the damage they deal. They're all kinds of fucked. Anyway, let's get back to what his point is about this thing. We'll probably finish the Nightmare of Mensis and the Mikolash fight. And then we might end the stream, because I'm not going to be able to finish this stream today. But next time, oh boy, we'll be at the end.
Dark Souls had a massive scam running throughout it with Frank's whole Link the Fire nonsense, but Bloodborne is a completely different world once you've been through it once already.
No, it's not. Again, he's just making shit up to make Bloodborne seem more special. It's like, now the concept of Bloodborne is that there's like different sort of levels of reality, right? You see that in the like the great ones and shit like that. You know, it's like they all still exist, you know. So on that aspect, I can understand, right? But there's also the thing with Dark Souls where it's all real, like it's all happening in real time. It's real. You know, this is the world and this is how you are impacting it. You know, Bloodborne has more of a thing where you're kind of dealing with different sections of reality as they're shifting based on what the great ones are doing, right? And how they affect reality.
Going back to Josefka's clinic and fighting beasts in the streets of Yharnam develops a sort of quaintness, since you know that just beyond your sight there are eldritch horrors beyond human imaginings, and madmen who are plotting to evolve. Speak of the devil. Mikolash's fight is one of those anti-boss fights, which FromSoft likes to do every now and then.
And this is one thing I kind of like the gimmick of the Mikolash fight. Only thing I would complain about is the arcane, like meteor shower thing he does. That thing does way too much fucking damage. It's so annoying. But otherwise, really interesting gimmick.
He's been stuck in the nightmare long enough for his body in the waking world to mummify, and he already believed that madness was the key to ascension. So it makes sense that his fight is a bit unorthodox, considering it's a bit of characterization. Just like Willem, Mikolash believes that the limitations of human thought is what keeps them from ascending to great ones, and like Willem, he sees the acquisition of inhuman knowledge as the way forwards. The point of the Red Moon was to make the boundaries of human thoughts vague, i.e., make everyone go insane. And that's because Mikolash thinks that's how you evolve. And he's not exactly wrong. We ascend in the end because we inherit the madness of the third courts,
but Mikolas still needs those cords if he is to ascend. He beckons Kos in this nightmare to plant eyes on the inside of his brains, and he is using Murgo as bait, just like how Lawrence and Gurman used Annalise's.
Now, this is one thing about this boss fight that can trivialize a little bit, is when he gets stuck on an enemy in there.
Using Murgo as bait, just like how Lawrence and Gurman used Annalise's child to lure the moon presence. Kos is dead in the waking world, but probably still alive in the dreamlands. There's a passage from Lovecraft's The Nameless City which reads, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die." And I think it goes some ways towards explaining this. Kos is not explicitly a being of the waking world, so it makes sense that it wouldn't be bound by its rules. Sure, you can kill Kos, but death needs not be permanent for something like it. If Kos is a creature out of time, for example, then it's possible that where it's from, death doesn't exist anymore. Or maybe its body is just an avatar for its spirit. Alternatively, it manages to survive in the dreamlands just like Mikolas, Maria, and Lawrence, whose bodies in the waking world are long since dead. Mikolas used to be the guide NPC of the game, and him running away from us might have been an extension of the chase where he would run into the ocean in Hemwick, which is why he talks about hunters being hunters even in a dream here, like he knows anything about us. FromSoft stories always seem to take place after things have truly collapsed and you rarely interact with anyone at their prime. Usually the enemies are just whoever survived a great cataclysm and staggered to continue fighting. See the Old Monk, True King Alat, the Bat of Chaos, Old Ishin, Gwyn, the Twin Princes, the Old Demon King, for examples. With that in mind, the player's sense of smallness in the world is always maintained, since even though they killed someone of such high stature, there's an understanding that if the player had come earlier, they might have had their ass handed to them. Demon Souls and Dark Souls are much grander in scope than Bloodborne is, so the fall from greatness their areas showcase is seemingly much bigger, but Bloodborne doesn't really show the fall in the same way anyways, so it's not necessarily a one-to-one comparison. People don't just fizzle out in Bloodborne. They go mad, and you get the sense that, yeah, this person might have been formidable at some point, but they are simply too far gone to be a threat to me anymore, and bosses like Mikolas benefit a lot from this. I can imagine in Dark Souls, this guy would have just been a powerful wizard with sunken eyes or something, but I think that he isn't, that he is just an NPC who's crazy, is very Bloodborne.
I mean, you could technically just flip this and just say, he could be a powerful spellcaster who guards something important and has lost any other sense of self besides his one purpose, similar to Gwyn, you might say. Because Gwyn looks super hollow when you fight him, and he's guarding his thing, and that's his character, right? His entire characterization, is summed up by being there. He is obsessed with keeping the fire lit, and he's burnt everything around him to keep it going, and now his only thing that he can think of is burning it, and killing you. It's like Mikolas could do something similar that's more dynamic than just be a wizard with sunken eyes. It's like it could be a lot more interesting. Could be a lot more.
He's sandwiched in between the One Reborn and the Wet Nurse, so if players want more conventional bosses to close out the game, they'll get that, but I always kinda like when FromSoft makes bosses which don't adhere to expectations, and I think Mikolas is really well implemented, all things considered. It's interesting that these games managed to contextualize the enemies' antagonisms to the players as well as they do, bosses and mobs. In Demon Souls, everyone was pretty much just mad, a monster or a demon. In Dark Souls, this opened up some with hollows, monsters, and demons, but also ghosts and illusions placed to guard places, guardians of paintings, and things of that nature. You can assume that some of the enemies might still have had their wits about them, and that their antagonism made sense because they were performing a duty.
I kind of lied. I kind of want to finish this Nightmare Immensis section, and then we can get to like some of the big stuff in the end next time, but we'll see how it goes.
Bloodborne has xenophobic Yarnamites, bloodthirsty monsters, faction-aligned NPCs, madmen, ancient...
Okay, he covered a lot of stuff in Dark Souls and Demon Souls with this really broad stroke, and then he's bringing up really specific things in Bloodborne. Doesn't sound like a fair comparison, does it?
races, mad ghosts, insane patients, spiteful villagers, and unexplainable cosmic aliens, just to name a few.
I'm kind of getting to the point where I'm not really about refuting his points anymore because I've already done it in previous streams or even in this one. So now I'm just kind of tired. I'm gonna try to argue against things that I think are new, or at the very least I can't remember him bringing up. But I'm just getting real tired of this video at this point. It says, I feel like butter stretched across too much bread. It's just fucking A.
And each one's reasoning for being hostile to you makes sense, even more so than in the previous Souls games. And I don't think there's any area which really comes up short in this regard. For comparison's sake, in Dark Souls, Gwendolyn was making Anor Londo appear to be lively so that you'd fulfill the prophecy of linking the fire, but even after the player agreed to do that, Gwendolyn didn't de-aggro any of the enemies. For gameplay reasons, I understand.
He didn't de-aggro any of the enemies. Yeah, but a lot of them got fucking deleted. Like, hold on. Let me get the full context of this, because if he's talking about, like, the enemies during the illusion, that's one thing. If he's talking about enemies, like, after the illusion, that's something else.
Making Anor Londo appear to be lively so that you'd fulfill the prophecy of linking the fire, but even after the player agreed to do that, Gwendolyn didn't de-aggro any of the enemies.
Yeah, I think this is one interesting thing about Dark Souls that you can kind of toy around with in discussion is, you know, why do all these enemies fight you? And I wonder if it's a mixture of not knowing who you are because they've hollowed or because they've kind of lost their minds. And if it's a mixture of that along with judging you to make sure you are strong enough to link the fire, right? Because it's a thing where the stronger you are, the stronger the link with the fire becomes in the Dark Souls game. So it's like I wonder if that's sort of a test within itself. Is like, are you powerful enough to link the fire on the same level that like Gwyn tried to? You know, or are you just going to be a little peon that burns the fire for like 10 minutes and then we need to go find another warrior? You know, like I wonder about that.
For gameplay reasons, I understand why that wasn't done, and this is in no way something I have deep feelings about, but seeing it improved on in Bloodborne is still nice.
Hold on a minute.
And didn't de-fire, but appear to be lively so that you'd fulfill the prophecy of linking the fire, but even after the player agreed to do that, Gwendolyn didn't de-aggro any of the enemies. For gameplay reasons, I understand why that wasn't done, and this is in no way something I have deep feelings about, but seeing it improved on in Bloodborne is still nice.
What do you mean?
As much as the story in Bloodborne's world is about madness and the limitations of thought, it's interesting that it doesn't lean on it nearly as much as its predecessors when it comes to contextualizing enemy hostilities. The story in Bloodborne's world is about madness and the limitations of thought. It's interesting that it doesn't lean on it nearly as much as its predecessors when it comes to contextualizing enemy hostilities.
I mean, it's a thing where most of the enemies in the games will try to kill you, and that's across both games. And there is madness in both games. Now, Bloodborne tilts a lot more towards madness just because of the way it defines madness and what it uses it for, but this is one of those things where I think he's sort of half right, but also half wrong at the same time. It's just, I mean, again, I'm getting kind of tired of this video. I kind of just wanted to end.
The Winter Lantern enemies are probably the most hated in the game because they don't really play like any other mob enemy.
No, it's because they're annoying as fuck to fight when they build up your frenzy meter just by looking at them. Right? That kind of shit's really annoying as a gimmick. It's really annoying. That's the problem. It's not because they fight differently. It's because of the way they fight differently.
Bloodborne has some rudimentary stealth mechanics which players will likely pick up intuitively and learn to integrate into their playstyle. Enemies don't aggro the player all at once in a given area. They need to be triggered into hostility, and they have seemingly 3 ways of doing this. For one, they all have cones of vision, so if they see you, they'll attack you. They also have a radius of hearing where they can notice you if you're running behind them. The blue elixir makes the player mostly invisible but does not mask sounds, so if players use it, they'll still have to tippy-toe around the enemies if they want to be unseen. Finally, certain enemies also seem to be able to smell the player, so hiding and walking slowly won't help much against them. The Winter Lanterns play on our situational awareness because we will likely have intuited the ways enemies aggro by the time we first encounter these things. Walking towards the Winter Lanterns will build up the frenzy meter, so players need to have sedatives equipped if they want to be safe, but a lot of players trip up because they don't dedicate themselves to the strike against these things. The Winter Lanterns play on situational awareness because they cannot be snuck up on, because they have a 360-degree field of vision. So if you run towards one...
I mean, that's not true, because, you can sneak up on them. You just can't do it the traditional way of, getting behind them. You just have to stay behind cover and be out of their sort of line of sight. It works the same, it's just their line of sight is a larger radius in that it's a total radius. So just keep something between you and them and you'll be okay. In terms of quote unquote sneaking up to them. He's just not explaining it the best way it could be explained.
Hoping to sneak attack, you're going to be disappointed, and if you try to back off, you can easily screw yourself. The best trick I've found is to just hammer them with something big enough to stunlock them and take the frenzy hit. What these things...
This is one thing that I would actually probably do in my run. I haven't gotten to the Nightmare of Mensis yet in the run that I've been doing during this, just because I barely play, but I'm playing a little bit. But what I would do is, right now I've got the I have Ludwig's Holy Blade, and I've got it where one of the gem slots regenerates HP. So the way I would fight them is I would probably fight them, beat the crap out of them as quickly as I could, take the frenzy hit, and then just sit and regenerate. It's not the funnest way to do it, but it is the most resourceful way to do it in terms of keeping, not using vials or resources, because if you have the opportunity to be patient and regenerate health, then why not do it? At least that's my philosophy on it.
Things is pretty interesting. They might be an enemy repurposed for the Nightmare Frontier, and by extension the Nightmare of Mensis, and also placed in the fishing hamlet. They are wearing the same clothes as the doll, except theirs has been torn, and they just have a smaller version of the brain of Mensis glued to their heads. What that was originally supposed to mean is anyone's guess. As much as they are a hassle to deal with for many builds, they drop some of the best gems in the game, especially the fishing hamlet ones, so I always spend some time fighting them, trying to get my hands on some. Since I've picked up the Blood Rock, there is now only one thing left to do before meeting up with the wet nurse, and that is communicating with the brain. While I do that, here's another theory I have.
Oh god, more theories. Oh.
Pretty sure that the Nightmare of Mensis was designed to remind players of Latria. Latria is the most beloved level from Demon's Souls, and arguably the most beloved From Software level of all time.
That's heavily subjective, dude. You can't just throw that out there. God, passing off opinion as fact. I'm so tired of that in this video. I'm so tired of all of his all of his mannerisms in this video. It's very annoying.
Though for Demon Souls, I have an affinity for Stone Fang. And the fan feedback on that level might be why the final gauntlet in Bloodborne is very prison-based, with cages, wardens, and such, and why it has a giant strung-up organ, the heart of Latria, the brain of the nightmare, strung up on chains which we can collapse to bring about a localized change in the area map. Also, no area in the game has as many winter lanterns as the Nightmare of Mensis does, and they seem to be this game's version of the Mind Flayers. I mean, I guess the Brain Suckers are literally the most similar moveset-wise, but in terms of enemies which cause panic in the players, I think the Winter Lanterns are more like the Mind Flayers than the Brain Suckers are, even though the Brain Suckers share more moves with them.
Moon.
The run-up to the final boss of the area contains some of the highest blood echo drops in the main game, so in case you're having a hard time closing things out, FromSoft's got your back. The ending of Bloodborne seems to draw much more from Demon Souls than Dark Souls, what with a final run-up to a boss in a high tower which opens up the final boss in the central hub which the level lady leads you to, but it's maybe a bit more chaotic than either of those games' endings were. There's a lot of characters appearing for the first time, there's a lot of cutscenes considering this is a Souls game, but overall I think it still manages to close out this game really well. The Nightmare of Mensis is arguably the area in the game which is most dripping in mood, and there's no question that this is the final level once you get here.
This is one thing that I kind of have mixed feelings about regarding Bloodborne's finale is I like how you can have 3 different endings that end with 3 different boss fights, but at the same time, the requirements to reach them, I think, like the fact that you will get a certain ending depending on which boss you kill at the end, I think in itself is a problem. Like I like the way that you can end with Murgo's Wet Nurse, Gurman, or the Moon Presence. I like that you can end the game with any of those 3 fights. My problem is that you are tied to the ending that boss gives you, right? And that's one thing that I don't like. That's one thing that I think Dark Souls 3 made a huge improvement on is when you have more than 2 endings, your quest line up to that point dictates what happens, right? And I think that the way Dark Souls 3 set it up is a lot better than Bloodborne. And Elden Ring, I think, is an even bigger step up than that, right? Because you can summon Ronnie, you can summon different people, and you can touch the thing. It's a lot easier to deal with the options, whereas Bloodborne is very restrictive in that sense. Similarly to Dark Souls, Dark Souls and Demon Souls 2 are very restrictive in the way they handle the endings. It's like you beat the last boss, you click one button or the other, and then you're done. Whereas Bloodborne is probably the most restrictive of their games. I don't know about Sekiro, but it seems extremely restrictive because if you want to fight Gurman, you are either going to get his ending or the Moon Presence ending. You don't get the option to do the, as far as I know, you don't get the option to do the Murgo Wet Nurse ending, right? Similar thing with the Moon Presence. You have to get the Moon Presence ending after, you fight Gurman and the Wet Nurse, right? And the opposite is true too. If you want to fight the Wet Nurse, you can do any of these endings. It's just the more bosses you add, the less endings that are available to you. And I do find that kind of annoying mechanically. As well as if I don't want an ending, but I want to fight a boss, I like the freedom to be able to pick and choose which boss I fight, right? And that's one thing that I'm glad that they shifted away from with later games is not having it where the endings are so tied to the bosses. Sekiro has branched endings, but one ending locks out the last third of the game if you do it. Wow, that sucks. I'm kind of glad I didn't finish Sekiro then. Holy shit, that's a massive, like, I mean, even if you're just being hyperbolic, that's still like a massive, like, fuck you to the player kind of a thing. Damn. You know, I had actually thought about playing Sekiro more, but now that you mentioned that, I kind of don't want to play it if it's going to cut out a third of the game if I don't know what the ending is. Holy shit. But anyway, let's wrap up the Nightmare Mensis and end this stream. I gotta go do stuff. I gotta go live my life. Move on from this video.
I'd be lying if I said I didn't prefer the more somber and understated ending in Dark Souls, but this area is a lot more in keeping with the kind of game Bloodborne is. Dark Souls' quiet walk to the kiln was very fitting for it, because that game is mostly about walking from A to B, fighting some enemies along the way.
Okay. If he's about to say Bloodborne doesn't do the exact same fucking thing, I might lose my fucking shit. I'm so tired of him just fucking up the way he describes one game to make Bloodborne look better. I'm so goddamn tired of this shit. I swear. I swear. Oh. Can easily make the mistake if you make the wrong choice at one point in the game. Well, damn, you are not selling Sekiro to me, Andrew, and I'm kind of thankful for that because the controls for that thing on PC are shit. Really are shit. But like this, the thing he's talking about here, I think is about to infuriate the fuck out of me.
Furthermore, somber and understated ending in Dark Souls, but this area is a lot more in keeping with the kind of game Bloodborne is. Dark Souls' quiet walk to the kiln was very fitting for it, because that game is mostly about walking from A to B, fighting some enemies along the way. Bloodborne reverses this. That is, this is a game where you fight a lot of enemies and then make your way to the next one. That is compared to Dark Souls, not in an absolute. So,
what the fuck does that mean? What does that mean?
The kiln was very fitting for it, because that game is mostly about walking from A to B, fighting some enemies along the way. Bloodborne reverses this. That is, this is a game where you fight a lot of enemies and then make your way to the next one. That is compared to Dark Souls, not in an absolute. So it might have felt a bit off if all of a sudden the game got super quiet and ambient for some stretch of time.
Okay, so he's talking about the build up to the finale. Okay, so he's talking about the build up to the finale. I thought he was going to say something way different, but I mean, the build up to the endings of each game are not quiet. I mean, you fight every variation of the Black Knights on your way to Gwyn, right? Arguably some of the toughest enemies in the game, right? Like you have to be good against every type of knight or run past them to get to Gwyn. You know, which can be very difficult on the rafters. So, I mean, it's not like Dark Souls is a quiet run up to the boss. I mean, I think the run up to the final boss of Bloodborne is, depending on what you want to classify as final boss. I'm going to say final boss in terms of Murgo. Murgo is where the final boss encounters begin, right? Where there's nothing else in between. So I would say that, you know, the build up to Murgo is a long sort of path dealing with ever increasing threats until you actually get to Murgo and you get to the end, or at least the end game, right? So that I can kind of understand as like a point of difference between Dark Souls and this game. I just wonder why he's bringing that up.
The game got super quiet and ambient for some stretch of time. I think the reason the final gauntlets have gotten relatively easy since Demon Souls is because FromSoft might have gotten enough feedback on the last stage of Boletaria where players just put the game down, satisfied enough with having completed most of the game rather than the whole thing.
I mean, that's a really weird argument to make. It's like players got far enough and then just gave up instead of finishing through. I mean, that's a massive... I mean, it's a really roundabout way to insult Demon Souls, saying that people just gave up before the end when they're at the end. Like, there's like even the most positive spin of that idea doesn't make the game look good. It's like saying, I love Lord of the Rings, but I just couldn't continue any farther because I had had so much goodness and vibes after Sauron was destroyed. I didn't need to see the rest of the ending. It's like, what? Like, are you retarded? Like, if you are enjoying your experience, you will see it through to the end. If you're not, you're going to put it down and not come back. Right? Like, what the fuck? He argues so weirdly for things in this video.
Alternatively, it's possible that they decided they just didn't want the final moments being frustrating, so they focused more on the experience in these games near the end rather than the challenge, because however hard the final boss is, it's not a fight in its own right. It's a cap off to the rest of the game, and so it can be whatever and still be satisfying on the back of the rest of the experience.
I'd argue against this. I'd say like you need to be like the final fight needs to be a good one to end on a high note, right? Because even though Gwyn is relatively simple in terms of how his fight works compared to some of the other bosses in the game, it's still an engaging fight. Like he still hits really hard, right? So if you don't do parrying, like you can have a hard time with Gwyn. Like he's not a complete pushover. I can get skipping after Sauron since they cut a good that was in the books. I mean, that's one thing though, is like if the story continues, wouldn't you want to see the end? Like this is Lord of the Rings in general. This is not just the movies or just the books. My point was that if there is more stuff that happens, and the story's not over technically, then why wouldn't you continue? Like I don't know what chapter Sauron gets defeated in the books, and then how many pages and chapters are after that. But like, my main point is like, if you're enjoying the experience, why wouldn't you keep going? Like people stop whenever the experience is not what they want, right? I mean, look at the current MCU. A lot of people don't like the MCU anymore because we've had a lot of bad films in a row, right? We've had like 3 good films after Endgame, right? Out of what, like 15? Or something. Like my point is that if people are enjoying the experience, they're going to follow through and continue on. They're not just going to put the thing down and say, okay, I'm good enough. It's like, it's just a weird argument on Acer's part.
For what my opinion is worth, I do think Dark Souls 1's ending is still the best crafted. I think slowing down and letting the players set their own pace at the end gives a better sense of closure than having them get too tense. If Murgo's wet nurse was the final boss of the entire game rather than the final boss of the final gauntlet,
I mean, Murgo's wet nurse counts as a final boss. Acer, I don't know if you know this, but there is an ending after Murgo. Or after the wet nurse. So it counts as a final boss, right? A final boss is a boss that you get before the credits, the last boss before the credits. Just because it's one of 3 potential endings doesn't mean that it's not a final boss. Like that is what you're saying is untrue. You're interpreting it wrong. I'm going to say it now. Murgo's wet nurse counts as the final boss, as one of the final bosses of the game. Yeah, definitely in the book, Saruman and Grima try invading the Shire, and the hobbits whoop them. Yeah, and I know about that. I'm just saying that, like, stopping when the story has more stuff. It's like reading I guess a better way to put it, just in like really simple terms, is just, it's like reading a book that you enjoy, and you've got 30 more pages of story left, but then you just put it down because you don't want, because you're enjoying it, but you don't want to read anymore. That to me is just illogical, right? That makes no sense. Like, why would you stop reading a good book that you are enjoying when it has more to it, right? Like, unless you just have things in your life take over reading, engaging with that media, then I don't think you have an excuse to not finish it, right? Like, if life doesn't get in the way and you have the time and you're enjoying the story, why would you stop? Like, it doesn't make sense for you to stop. If nothing else is getting in the way, and you're enjoying it. You know, Acer just made a really weird argument about it, and that's the kind of thing where it's just he phrased it so weirdly.
At 2/10. If Murgo's wet nurse was the final boss of the entire game rather than
It technically is a final boss of the game.
the final boss of the final gauntlet, it'd be fairly underwhelming, I think. But as the prelude to Gurman and the Moon Presence, this is alright, and serves as a good juxtaposition with what the actual final bosses have to offer.
I don't think it serves as a juxtaposition to anything, considering it is one of 3 final bosses you can have depending on the ending you want. I mean, again, it's a part of a package, right? The package is how the 3 endings and the 3 bosses act as finales to the game. You can't just say that the Moon Presence is the definitive finale of the game when there are 3 endings that end with the Moon Presence, Gurman, or the Wet Nurse. It's like they all have to be taken as endings. You know, it's not like this is the true ending. It's like, no, these are different endings. These are different endings that are real. They need to be treated as such.
Outside of the fight arena, Queen Yarnum stands powerless, listening to her child cry. In the Chalice dungeons, we can actually fight her while she's still pregnant with the infant. And the implication there is that the queen is not the powerful one, but rather that she is an avatar through which Murgo was able to express its immense power, or that Murgo is what gave the queen that power. That's why she's standing outside now, helpless, rather than going in and ripping the wet nurse to shreds, which she otherwise very much could do. Her fight is a lot tougher than the wet nurse's. Without Murgo, Yarnum's immense power is gone, and so it falls on our capable hands to make things right. The wet nurse is some unnamed great one which has seemingly been lured here by the prospect of obtaining an infant. And this can be a very hectic fight depending on how you play, but I'm massively overleveled at this point, so I make short work of it.
This is the one thing, Vic, is like, I do genuinely wonder if some of the way he phrases things is because of, you know, maybe because it sounds like English isn't his first language to begin with, so I wonder if maybe he doesn't have the full grasp of how certain words work. And I mean, to be fair, like I mentioned this earlier, like I don't have the best grasp of English language either. That's the only one I fucking speak. But, you know, it's just, it's very obvious that he's odd in the way he explains his things, and the way he does it is very strange. But let's watch him make short work of the wet nurse.
There's a move the boss performs where it clouds the arena in a dark mist and multiplies itself, but like most other enemies, the wet nurse can be stunned if you manage to break its health below certain thresholds. Stuns instantly close out the active animation in favor of the stun animation, and if I were using Ludwig's Holy Blade or something equally strong, I could break the boss faster than it would take to summon the mist, and so I could prevent that part of the fight from even triggering. There's a Japanese word used in action games which is okizeme, and it describes the effect of one player leveraging their standing advantage over an enemy who is grounded. This is usually used in a derogatory sense, or to denote when a player is not honoring the fight. So, of course, I do this all the time. Specifically on this run, you've seen me on multiple occasions knock an enemy down, which locks them into a getting up animation, and me using their getting up animation to charge up my transformed R2 attack. Now, I don't think anyone would call foul play on me for using it, since I didn't do any online, but also because the enemies in the game are not that fussed about spamming attacks over your body when you're trying to get up. So abiding by some honor system relating to this world would create an asymmetry which would exclusively hurt me.
I think he's kind of missing the point of that Japanese term, where I feel like the term exists because people cheese enemies, not because they use things in the game against the enemy, like that the enemy, you know, just can't account for, right? Like I think the term was it sounds like from the way he described it is that it was invented for people who actively try to cheese enemies to finish the game, right? Or to beat the boss or to beat the encounter, right? They don't cheat per se, but they use fuck ups in the game's code to their advantage, so to speak. So it's it's like knowing when an enemy can get stuck like in a specific part of the arena if you get them to aim at a certain angle, right? That's the kind of thing that I think people would look as sort of a dishonorable version of the fight, right? A good example would be let's take Gwyn's fight for example, right? You can parry him, which makes the fight a lot easier, but you still have to get the parry, and the parry is a part of the mechanics. It's just the mechanics are built into the game, right? And they work certain ways. But if the Gwyn fight was trivialized, if I got behind a certain mound of dirt in the boss fight, right? Like he just stopped moving, stopped attacking, wouldn't do anything, and would glitch out and wouldn't do anything as long as I was behind that pile, I could just shoot him and beat the boss fight. That's cheesing it. It's a difference between doing a strategy that works within the mechanics of the way the game functions versus cheesing an enemy because they have an exploit that makes them weak, or it breaks their AI. It breaks the code that makes them work, basically. You're not using the systems of the game against the boss like you would normally. You're doing something that the boss cannot account for, because they are not coded to deal with it, and there's no system in the game like that. Basically glitching your way through the game as opposed to actually fighting it on somewhat even terms, given what the game can do and given what you're supposed to be able to do given the game's mechanics. It's like watching you in your DS2 first run dealing with the old knights and Hade. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's like those enemies spin around and they move on the ground. So when you're near the edge, you can bait them off. That's a thing where you're using the mechanics of the game against it, and cheesing them to a certain extent. It's not like it's not like I'm glitching them. It's like I'm using the fact that they move in a specific pattern against them. And one thing about Murgo's Wet Nurse, like as a fight, is when I got to it and beat it, I beat it on the first try because I found that, when it does its little, super long slashy combo, if you're behind it, you can get behind it and not get hit like fairly often, right? Or maybe you'll get hit once and you can lay down some damage during the time it's not hitting you. And I did that during this whole second phase and kicked its ass, right? That's one move with a clear exploit similar to Gwyn that is within the realm of the mechanics. It's not a glitch. You are just using their moveset to your advantage.
After killing the wet nurse, we end Murgo's crying, and contrary to popular theory, no, Murgo cannot be made to laugh by playing the music box. The chord we get after
That was a really long pause. That was really long.
finishing the job here is a clue to the player about what to do next. We've untangled every secret of this world thus far, and the final mystery comes to us now at the end. Uncover what the chords are, and fetch the rest.
All right, we're gonna have to stop the stream here because I got to go do shit, and this next half hour I'm gonna save for next time. Hopefully, it'll be a fun short stream. Cheesing Gwyn by baiting out his parryable move by drinking from your flask. Again, I don't think that's technically cheesing. Like my view of cheesing is doing stuff that the enemies can't. Like they're not like breaking code in the game's mechanics to make the fight work, right? Like baiting animations, I think, is a viable tactic because they're built to, do things on certain animations. And this is one thing. It's a very complicated issue. I don't think there's a real easy way to break down exactly what is, cheesing versus glitching versus using the mechanics against them. But yeah, I'm going to end this stream here because I got to go live my life. But when we come back, we are going to be into this ending, and I want to see what he has to say because it's been a wild ride that I don't want to repeat, but I'm really curious what he's going to say at the end. I wonder if he'll say anything that will infuriate me into the future, but we will see how that goes next time. And yeah, and as I mentioned in the end of the previous stream, if you have any video you want me to react to, doesn't have to be Souls content, just leave a link in the comments. I will find it and save it later, and we will watch it later at some date, and we will see how it goes. But yeah, I'd just like to thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys later.